Okay, hi everybody. I hope you had a pleasant walk. For those that did walk, at least it wasn't raining and you had a little bit of sunshine, a brisk breeze to wake you up again. So we're going to get started with the afternoon session. Panel 6 is the Introduction to Shared River Basin Governance. So this session will explore models for governance of transboundary river basins from North America and around the world. We focus on how basins address Indigenous sovereignty, public engagement, data and information sharing, and incorporating hydrologic and social changes over time. I would like to introduce Dr. Aaron T. Wolf, who is a water resources geographer at Oregon State University and a trained mediator facilitator. He co-directs the program in water conflict management and transformation, through which he has offered workshops, facilitations, and mediations around the world. He is the author, most recently, of The Spirit of Dialogue, Lessons from Faith Traditions in Transforming Conflict. And his co-presenter or moderator will be Henry Pitts. Henry is the USA co-president of the North American Youth Parliament of Water, a youth-led transboundary nonprofit dedicated to amplifying youth voices in the water sector. He is also a PhD student at Oregon State University, where he recently earned a master's in water resources, policy, and management. I will turn it over to Henry. Just so that you know, the green button takes the slides forward, red button takes them back. That's the laser pointer.
Perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for being here this afternoon for Panel 6, Introduction to Shared River Basin Governance. Over the next hour and a half, you'll hear from 4 wonderful minds who currently study and work on transboundary river governance. As we look to bolster and improve public engagement within the Columbia River Basin, it became important to start to look to other examples of governance and engagement around the world. So you'll be hearing some of those examples here today, and then that will lead really well into our governance roundtable, where we'll hear some perspectives about how this can be mobilized in the future for the Columbia. So each of our speakers will have 15 minutes. We'll hold all of the questions until the end. At that point, I'll come down into the audience with the microphone and walk around, and we'll take questions live rather than doing the note card as we've been doing previously. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Glenn Benoit. Glenn is the Director of Sciences and Engineering for the Canadian section of the International Joint Commission, the IJC. He's the Canadian section's lead advisor to the IJC on its transboundary water pollution reference in the Elk Kootenai watershed. His academic interests include limnology, environmental modeling, transboundary water management, and science diplomacy. Thanks, Glenn. Yes,
clicker here?
and this advances, and that brings you back.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Me again. I was thinking if we took this somewhere else, we could be like a traveling road show. You know, if we keep this momentum going. So it's my pleasure, and I thank you again for considering me as a member of this panel to talk about the IJC and the work of our boards. So this will be a very different presentation, more of a survey of how our boards function across the transboundary region. But I'll preface it with just a bit of a recap on exactly what the IJC is. Where's my, okay, there. So 3 things I'll cover in the next 15 minutes. The boards of the International Joint Commission, something called the International Watersheds Initiative, and then I'll go through some profiles of some of our boards that I think have some interesting governance models which may be relevant elsewhere. They're very much homegrown, built for purpose where they are, but there are certainly some potential transferabilities and things that are relevant from one basin or watershed or context to another. So like I said at the previous presentation, maybe just 3 hours ago, the treaty, the Boundary Waters Treaty, and just to remind everyone, excuse me, that we are a distinct treaty from the Columbia Rivers Treaty. We predate it by about 50 years or so, And its origins, as I said before, had to do with the prevention and resolution of disputes, whatever those disputes may be along the border. I showed some pictures of what some of the original disputes were that gave rise to the treaty, but since then, as I said, through those 60 orders of approval and those 60 references, we've been asked to do work in many other aspects of transboundary primarily transboundary water-related issues. So the treaty itself is a short document, and it provides the principles and mechanisms to help prevent and resolve disputes along the boundary. And it's more than just boundary waters. It has the potential to be used in other contexts. But by and large, it is a water-based treaty. One thing I didn't mention before, but I have some slides at the end which has come up in some conversations since my presentation earlier today, is that within the Columbia River system, we do have three boards of control that manage water levels in the Columbia, Kootenai, and Osoyoos systems. And they're there because they predate the Columbia River Treaty. And so there's a separate system of governance, separate from the Columbia River Treaty, but they are in operation. They are continuously in operation right now. So we can talk about that more later if you'd like, but I thought I would just footnote that because it does come up from time to time, but they are distinct and separate treaty-based entities in the same system. And like I said before, I think the parties to the treaty are Global Affairs Canada and Department of State. That's who we are ultimately accountable to, as they are the signatories to the treaty. And I won't get into this. I went through this morning in some detail already, just the nature of how we get our authorities. So remember I showed that image of North America, and it showed all the transboundary systems from coast to coast to coast. We do not have authorities across the border. It's important to remember that our authorities are basically assigned to us by State Department and Global Affairs, and that very much defines what we can and cannot do. Within that parameter space, there's a lot that we can do, but we do not venture out beyond where we have authorities, as we call them, from the governments to do work. So that's where, in a couple of slides, you'll see why it may appear to be a bit of an incomplete set of watersheds across the whole of the transboundary region, and that's why, because we're essentially, we're an instrument of the two governments to prevent and resolve disputes when necessary, when appropriate, and from time to time, we then have an ongoing or indeterminate place in a particular watershed. So we have maybe 12 or 15 boards across the transboundary region. Some of them are fairly small. They have a minor, or a really relatively modest set of authorities for what they do. Some of them have authorities, in terms of reference directives, which are more ambitious, and they cover broader aspects of water, of transboundary systems. And I'll sort of explain those in a little bit. The International Watersheds Initiative is something that came to the Commission at the turn of the most recent century, so the 21st century. And the Commission, the treaty had been in existence for almost 100 years at that point, and the governments basically posed a question to the Commission in the form of a reference. So they asked us to do this for them. Can you find a way to reimagine the work that is done under the treaty in a way which would be more modern, more contemporary, more inclusive, more comprehensive? And this gave rise to the report on the top there, the IJC in the 21st century. And that report basically described an idea, a model, an approach to sort of broaden what it is that the IJC and its boards can and should do in the prevention and resolution of disputes between the two countries in accordance with its existing authorities or mandates. So this is kind of, threading the needle, but it was something that was asked of us. And this gave rise to this International Watersheds Initiative, a program that exists to this day and will continue. That reference that we got to do this work for the International Watersheds Initiative is an ongoing reference. It doesn't come with a shelf life. Essentially, it is in perpetuity, in theory. And this Watersheds Initiative brought with it a number of principles for how our boards ought to go about doing their work. And the principles are things that we've heard a lot about here, of course, already. They're more contemporary, they're more progressive, more forward-thinking. an integrated ecosystem approach to transboundary water issues, binational collaboration, multinational collaboration, more and more, involvement of local expertise, the people who live in the basins, who live near the systems, they have a special perspective, view on water levels, water quality, water management. Public engagement, central to that sort of external check on the work that the Commission is doing. Balanced and inclusive board representation. So rather than the traditional model from much of the 20th century where mainly government officials would sit on our boards, no, let's broaden the composition, make it more reflective of the population who lives in a watershed. So we see public members, indigenous members, academics, different people to sort of make our boards more diverse. Open and respectful dialogue and an adaptive management perspective. The outcomes of that reference right off the top there were two things. One, an idea to create international watershed boards, so boards with broader responsibilities than previously. And second was the standing program to support IJC boards and their projects, and that's the IWI. There's a fund from both State Department and Global Affairs which helps us, it's seed money, project money to help boards do more creative things to help address the issues that they have identified within their systems. And that image on the bottom right there sort of marks the 25th anniversary. So we received that reference in 1999 or 98, and then in 2023 we had a couple of emeritus people from the Commission write a 25th sort of commemorative report. How far have we come along since that reference of 1998, and where are we now when it comes to the implementation of the International Watersheds Initiative? And these are available documents certainly on our website. This picture I showed before, and this sort of delineates the transboundary systems that we have had some role in or currently have a role in right now. And they stretch, like I said, from the Columbia River system there, where we have these 3 boards of control, all the way across to the far east at the mighty St. Croix system, which is shared by New Brunswick and Maine. Some of them, for example, the St. John River and Lac Champlain and the Richelieu River, we had references to do work in those 2 systems, and the references came with money and a time horizon of 4 or 5 years. We created study boards, full research, monitoring programs to go with them. We did the work, submitted their final reports and recommendations to the governments, and they said, thank you very much for your work. So that was a time-limited use of the Commission for those examples there, the St. John River and the Lake Champlain Richelieu River. Elsewhere, St. Mary, Red, Lake of the Woods, Great Lakes, we have ongoing responsibilities, and it's those places where we have boards and different sort of structures of the boards to deliver on the work that has been assigned to them. So I'll go through some of those in just a little bit of detail now. Like I said, these are the boards of the IJC. There are so-called boards of control, and those are the ones that really are engineering-based boards, and they deal with water levels and flows, often to do with hydropower, apportionment of water for whatever use, typically irrigation, and also dam operations. Watershed boards are boards that have a more comprehensive set of responsibilities. So some water management, water quality, aquatic ecosystem health, essentially a more holistic ecological perspective on the system. And we have 4 boards that sort of satisfy that kind of criteria of being a watershed board. We have 3 advisory boards, and those boards are within the space of the Great Lakes, and so they fall under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is a 50-plus-year-old document now, and it is fully about improving, restoring habitat, water quality in the Great Lakes Basin. And so those boards are advisory boards. They are in the business of doing reports on different issues they think are important, and then recommending them to the governments to modernize or revise the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And we have a Health Professionals Advisory Board as well, which is, there's not a lot of pattern here. There's a lot of unique situations. The Health Professionals Advisory Board, they advise on health-related matters that involve water typically. And so they have a role to play in some of our watersheds. So that's sort of our standard set of boards there on the left. Now on the right are study boards. One of them I talked about this morning, the Elk Kootenai Watershed. But there are 3 other ones that are in existence right now. One of them is right next door in the St. Mary Milk system, and that concerns apportionment from all the work that was done back at the turn of the 19th century concerning competition and indeed battles over access to water in the St. Mary and Milk system. And then there's an adaptive management committee for the Great Lakes Basin as a whole. And this is a big effort to basically look at the operation of 2 dams in the Great Lakes system. One at Moses Saunders, which controls water levels and flows in the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. And then one at Lake Superior, which controls water levels and flows in the St. Mary River, another St. Mary River, and in Lake Superior. And this is a big adaptive management project underway. I've heard adaptive management talked about quite a bit at the symposium, which is wonderful. I would say in an IJC context, this GLAM, as we call it, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Adaptive Management Committee, would be furthest along in sort of its implementation and use and expression and practice of adaptive management. So if people ask me about it in an IJC context, I often go to that one to say, look, these are some documents which might be of interest and relevant in terms of approach and framework for how that's being put together. So this is kind of the whole sort of family of boards. And the boards range from 2 people to 20 people to 28 people. It all depends on the authorities that we have from the governments and what number of people are needed to actually deliver on the work that's expected of us. So like I said, I'll just go through a quick tour of a few boards right now just to give you a bit of a flavor and a bit of a deeper dive into what I'm actually talking about, because the board may be kind of an abstract sort of idea here. So the Osoyoos Lake Board of Control, it's a control board. It has a fairly well-defined and limited mandate, and its implementation of the provisions of an order relative to the alteration and operation of the Zosel Dam, including responsibilities to issue drought declarations. So that's what it is responsible for doing. And there's lots to say about that, but I think more relevant for this group here, what's its governance model? It's a 10-person board. There are government officials, Indigenous representation, NGOs, and members of the public. Consensus-based decision-making, that's one of our policies within the Commission, and it has written into its directive annual public meetings and project-based engagement. So whenever they take on a new project, there's a duty, a role in public engagement, information out, public input in. And so that's an example of a control board, the Osoyoos board. And many people here may know quite a bit about this board, actually. The second board I wanted to talk about is the International Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Board. And so this is a board that was formerly a control board and a pollution board. And about 15 years ago, there used to be these 2 boards. One looked after a dam on Rainy River, and another board basically dealt with pollution in Rainy River. And they were separate entities. And thinking again about this idea of a watershed perspective and holistic ecology, why not bring them together? And so we got a reference to go through that exercise of determining what's the best governance model for this watershed. And we came up with this watershed board, and its roles ensure compliance with the order for this dam, and also on water levels in the Rainy Lake and the Namakan Reservoir, also to monitor and report on the ecological health, including water quality of the Lake of the Woods and Rainy Lake boundary waters in that aquatic ecosystem. So it's a big board. There are 20 people on that board, and it includes, again, the complement of more than just government people, Indigenous representation. There's tribes, there's the Métis Nation, and also First Nations in Canada. Nonprofit organizations and members of the public. So like I said, it's a bigger board and has quite an extensive committee structure to support it, involving a water levels committee, an adaptive management committee, ecosystem health, and an engagement committee. It also has advisory groups, people who are sort of outside of the board, provide input. Thank you. And it also has, as per you'll see, there's a bit of a pattern here, annual public meetings and project-based engagement. I'll go through the next ones a bit quickly because I have a closing slide that I'd like to get to. Great Lakes Science Advisory Board is one of those advisory boards under the Water Quality Agreement. And it does great work, but it is in an advisory capacity to the governments on the Water Quality Agreement. And it is a 14-person science priority committee, mainly academics, and a 14-person research coordination committee, mostly government officials. So I'm just trying to, the diversity or the different kinds of boards that the commission has under it, and this is one, and it's the Great Lakes Science Advisory Board, fully within the context of the Great Lakes Basin. And lastly, this is the study that's concurrent, that's happening right now, in the neighboring, on the other side of the divide, in the St. Mary milk system there. And this is a study board to look at some equations to share water between the countries for purposes of apportionment. There's a study board there. It's, I think, an 8-person study board, a mix of academics, government people, local expertise on that study board. And it has a responsibility to revisit these apportionment equations to see whether they need to be modernized, as they are quite old. From 1921 is when these equations were first developed by the engineers at that time. And the idea is to improve long-term resilience in accessing these shared waters between the two systems. And I just put there's a structure down there on the bottom left. We use this because it's kind of our most current existing study to help us inform what should the Elk Kootenai Watershed Study Board actually look like. So there's some commonalities between the two there. One thing you'll see is the Indigenous involvement, representation, participation is basically been on a growing trajectory for some time now. And it's manifest best now in the Elk Kootenai reference, which of course, as I mentioned, was put together in partnership with the Tanaha. So just a few takeaways right now, and this is my last slide. For the governance of our boards within the commission, there's a variety of sizes and structures to address these different mandates. Collaborative watershed governance is certainly the approach that is being taken more generally in all of our boards. Consensus-based decision-making is key to their success. Indigenous participant representation, as I just mentioned. There are committees, there are advisory groups, so they can be quite large entities with their different supporting pieces, and public engagement and input is throughout. A shared understanding and problem solving involves these kinds of things now: a watershed approach, an ecosystem health, adaptive management, evidence-based findings and recommendations, and then also a plurality of knowledge systems. And that's one that we are collaboratively, collectively trying to understand together. And that's it for me for right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It was nice to start off this session with basins that are in the same continental context, but for our next speaker, we'll be going a little further afield. We'll be hearing from Dr. Kinga Szalkai. Kinga is an associate professor at the Budapest Metropolitan University in Hungary and a Fulbright visiting researcher at Oregon State University's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Thanks, Kinga.
Thank you very much, Henry. I am very happy and I am very honored to stand here and to be in this very kind community of yours. I was sent here by the Hungarian-American Fulbright Committee to study good practices in the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty. But today I will reverse this role. And I will bring you some, or I hope to bring you some good practices, or at least good ideas from Europe and the European Union. Oh, wait. All right. So I will talk about the parallels and the good practices that can be drawn from the case of the European Union's strategy for the Danube River. And first, I would like to put that strategy, I will abbreviate it as the Danube strategy. I will put it into context because that's, I think that's necessary. Some of the colleagues here asked me in the coffee break, but what's similar between the European Union and the context in the Columbia River Basin? So first, I would like to go into the details of it. So on this map, you can see the European Union's member states marked with green. And you can see those countries which are within the Danube Basin but are not member states of the European Union with two different colors because there are two different status for them, both in the European Union and in the Danube River strategy. So we have three countries waiting for accession in the European Union, so Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is the rather troubled part of the Danube strategy, because here we have Moldova and Ukraine, which are nowadays obviously more busy with foreign policy and the war than with water issues. But still, the Danube strategy can work to mitigate the impact of war on the ecosystems in the Danube River Basin as well. And my point here is to show you the diversity of the actors. Of course, that it is a different diversity than the one present in the Columbia River. But here, there is one transnational, international actor, which is also supranational in some cases, the whole European Union. We have member states with different sovereignty, with different rights, with different obligations. Of course, the European Union has its own regulations regarding water, regarding rivers, pollution, water quality, and so on, very detailed ones. But of course, they do not apply to the whole Danube River Basin. And the countries which are not European Union member states are not obligated to follow those rules. If you look at the map more closely, you can discover something else. The members of the Danube strategy, or the participants, let's put it like this, the participants of the Danube region strategy are not always whole states. In the case of Ukraine, there are two counties that are parts of the strategy, not the whole country. In the case of Germany, it is probably much more interesting because Germany is a federal state, and we have two provinces in federal Germany, which are parts of the Danube strategy. So you probably now begin to see some parallels in this multiplicity of actors and stakeholders in the Danube River Basin. If I go further, this is just a list of what I have told you, and it's very obvious that it is a challenge to find a multi-stakeholder governance system for this multi-level governance system for this multitude of actors, which is also present in the Columbia River Basin. Let's move further and let's see what is the idea that holds together the basin, because what I have said so far showed you that the basin, so there is a basin-wide approach in the Danube River strategy. This is how these different actors come together there. The idea is to have a macro region. You can read the definition of the macro region on the slide. The point is geographical contingency. So a macro region in the European Union means the recognition of the community of interests in a certain geographical region, and it is aimed to maximize the benefits coming from that geographical contiguity. Well, in the Columbia River Basin, it is So this approach is on a higher level. It is on a spiritual level with the One River approach, about which we heard a lot during this symposium. The European Union has a technical level of cooperation. There are no indigenous peoples participating in the Danube strategy, and there is no kind of spiritual conscience, no actor playing the role of the spiritual conscience in the European Union. So macro-region is based on interest, but still it is created for the benefit of the actors. Then comes the part with the 3 no's that led to the creation of the macro-region. It could be an international river basin organization. In the Danube River Basin, there is the ICPDR. You may wonder I'm not talking about this. And the answer lies in the 3 no's that led to the creation of the macro-region. Because there was a limited political will to create a kind of geography-based community in the Danube Basin. So the 3 no's were, the 3 no's means that there couldn't have been a new legislation, there couldn't have been a new institution, and no new funding mechanisms could have been established there. If we come back to the Columbia River Basin, we see that this basin is probably more advanced on the level of no's, because in a very great step, new institutions were created. The JAB and the Kootenai Working Group are steps that are really appreciated. But well, it seems that this is the range of institutions that will be codified in the AIP. And in terms of actors, we have much more of them in the river basin. They will not get new institutions. They are not likely to get new institutions. Well, I was very happy to hear in the first panel yesterday that the JAB will try to integrate all the interests of other stakeholders as well, but it is yet to come. In terms of the wider stakeholders, there is something else that is probably needed in the operationalization of the AIP. If we think about an international river basin organization, it is a no in the case of the Columbia River Basin, or at least for the time being. It is not in the aims of the AIP. So there is again a limit. So in these limits, again, we find some parallels. And in the followings, I will show you how the Danube strategy dealt with these limitations. The last common thing, the last parallel is pillar structure. But if you look at the titles of the pillars in the Danube strategy, then you can see that they are very different pillars. They are even more vague. I mean, they are vague pillars. Strengthening the region, connecting the region, building prosperity. They could mean anything, right? There is an environmental leg of the European Union's Danube strategy that might be a bit more explicit, but this pillar strategy really do not say anything explicit. And here I would like to move on the good practices, because this very vague pillar system was operationalized in a rather complex way. So the operationalization of the Danube strategy added priority areas, clearly identified priority areas to these 4 pillars. And I think if you look at these priorities, these highlighted priority areas, you can have a much clearer picture what the Danube strategy can do, what it cannot do, of course, what are the limitations. But it's a pretty comprehensive framework with explicitly identified priorities. And several of these priorities have been mentioned throughout our symposium, and they are relevant in the case of the Columbia River Basin as well. In terms of operationalization, the Danube strategy goes even further, and it says, so now, yes, probably it is a rather complicated visual, so let's start on this side. So here are the 4 pillars. We already know the 4 pillars. In the previous slide, we have seen the priority areas. So here, there are again the priority areas. You can also see that they have their own dedicated steering groups. The idea of the Danube strategy was to allocate 2 stakeholders, like in this case, 2 participants of the Danube strategy, to each priority areas. So each of, if I go back, each of these priority areas are in the hand of 2 members, 2 participants of the strategy. They are responsible for those priority areas, not on the political level, but on the level of expertise. So scientists, experts sit there, and 2 stakeholders cooperate, at least 2. There are some where there are 3 of them, cooperate to make the most out of the implementation. So we are through with operationalization, we are at the implementation part now. And the responsibilities are clearly shared and clearly dedicated to those participants in the steering group and in the coordinators, priority area coordinators. We can see another interesting thing here, and that is the role of the national coordinators. It is a coordinative, as its name also suggests. It is a coordinative position. It is again not a political position. The task of the national coordinator is to be aware of the networks, of the related groups, communities, NGOs, whatever kind of stakeholders in their own countries related to the basin. So it is a nation-based, so stakeholder-based, and coordinative role to maintain connections, to strengthen connections, to facilitate discourse and discussion among the participants, not just the core stakeholders, not just the state participants, but all sub-state and interstate, transnational kind of actors as well. We have one more thing here that might be inspirative, and that's the Danube strategy point. The Danube strategy point is, well, I could say that it's kind of a secretariat for the whole system, but it has a much more important, I mean, in the sense of civic public engagement, it has a very important function, and that is that anybody living in the participant states of the Danube strategy can turn to this point to ask for information. It has consultation sessions, and there are even individual consultations if the individual turns directly to the strategy point. They also organize educational events. So it is a separate vehicle for communicating with the public, which is, I think, of core importance if an organization or a group intends to provide transparency and intends to aim for a wide public participation. So if I want to summarize all the ideas that I have collected here, so first I should talk about the parallels, and then I should talk about the good practices. So in the parallels, first we have the recognition in both basins that the basin is united, and the only chance to protect the resources and to benefit the ecosystem and benefit the stakeholders of the river basin is cooperation. That's a very firm starting point. There is a great number of core stakeholders. They have to face the challenges of multi-stakeholder, multi-level governance, and well, there are certain no's which will not happen in any of the basins in the short term, at least. So this is why I could talk about the comparison of these two cases, and what comes out of the comparison is the list of good practices that I listed here. The pillars are implemented through priority areas, that is the operationalization and the implementation, which involves clearly distributed tasks with a very inclusive structure in which all the stakeholders have their own responsibilities and allocated areas and where they work together. So there is not a case when one stakeholder is responsible for one area. And then we have the Danube strategy point for the distribution of information to the wider public. And there is one last case about which I don't really have the time to talk about. If I get questions about this, I will mention more details. Here I just would like to raise the events, the kind of more informal events organized by the coordinators of the Danube strategy, which strengthen the identity of belonging to the Danube, which strengthen communities for the wide public. And these are events like the Danube Annual Forum and the Danube Participation Day. So I would like to finish here. Once again, if you have questions about these initiatives, I will be happy to answer them. But for the time being, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kinga, for providing that global perspective. It's certainly interesting to consider how the different structures of those pillars has an impact on public engagement on the ground. Next, we'll be hearing from Adam Wicks-Arshak. Adam is a legal aid attorney and also coordinates quantitative legal research projects focusing on resilience, water law, governance, and the impacts of legislation on courthouse and environmental outcomes. Adam organized a panel at the Universities Consortium in 2019 Kimberly Symposium, where he asked how the process of citizen engagement will work in developing a governance model for the Columbia River Basin. Thank you, Adam.
Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this meeting, and I want to recognize all the tribal leaders and others in leadership positions who are doing what they can to promote good governance and a healthy Columbia River. The level of expertise in this room is astonishing and humbling, and so thank you all for what you do. I'll first share some thoughts on reflecting on what I've heard from yesterday's session, and especially Dr. Jeanette Armstrong's presentation last night. And then I'll share a few ideas that could be complementary to the AIP for how to strengthen governance within the Columbia River Treaty, which includes institutionalizing a comprehensive citizen engagement process and establishing an independent Transboundary Science Advisory Board. And finally, I want everybody to think bigger. We need to fully incorporate the one river, one basin approach into how we get along and how we govern. So what does a basin-wide governance approach look like? And what can we learn from the Danube River, who has a very complex basin, but are thinking at a basin-wide scale? So we need to have processes in place that are holistic, that take the entire basin into account. Last night, Dr. Jeanette Armstrong described a governance structure that thrived for thousands of years. Salmon were at the center. And this is an honest question. Does anyone here think the current governance structure will be around in another 1,000 years? If not, then what are we doing to improve the governance structure, the governance of the river and all that we receive from the river? What steps are being taken to ensure there's an ethical governance structure for future generations? What can we learn from a governance structure that centered salmon and managed resources and its citizen for thousands of years? Dr. Armstrong implored us to have a dialogue on every aspect to incorporate Indigenous guidance into the AIP, into the treaty, and into all other processes. She stressed that we should not be guided by past mistakes, but to be guided by how we treat each other. And so maybe I was a little naive at these conferences talking, beginning almost 10 years ago. I was just a youth who liked to go canoeing. I'm now 36 with a wife who actually met at one of these conferences and with 2 kids. But even then, there was broad consensus from the Columbia Basin citizens that transformative governance was needed to fully address the lack of transparency, flexibility, climate change, and other emerging issues. That we needed to get away from a governance structure steeped in anthrosupremacy and white supremacy. Everybody understands that we need to ensure power production goals are met and flood control processes must be in place to protect downstream communities. But as we have all learned from the One River Ethics Matter conference and the accounts of so many Indigenous people and basin citizens, the Columbia River Treaty has been achieving these goals at the expense of upriver transboundary communities and at the detriment of the ecosystem and in violation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, last night, Dr. Jeanette Armstrong told us that in her perspective, governance is how we get along, how we relate to each other at all levels, from the leaders who spoke 15 languages to the little kids listening to stories. Connections, respect, and reciprocity matter at all levels and must go in all directions. We should not continue down the path of top-down governance. And I don't think anybody thinks the federal governments know what's best and should have absolute authority to make decisions that impact us all. I know that the JEB is a huge and important first step to incorporating Indigenous guidance into the governance structure of the Columbia River Treaty. But as others have pointed out, an advisory role, or role that provides recommendation, is not an equitable table to govern from. An advisory role is different than a co-manager, and recommendations are not the same as voting members. I've heard a lot of talk that this is a modernized treaty, and I guess it is. In this modern day, the dominant settler community continues to refuse to relinquish authority in a meaningful way to create a balanced governance structure. And the AIP it does modernize the Columbia River Treaty and does achieve new benefits to the ecosystem and the inclusion of Indigenous nations in advisory roles. But I don't think it fully embraces the ethical approach the region has requested. It is still a top-down governance structure where the US and Canadian entities have absolute authority to make decisions without oversight or transparency. And I do understand that it is an incremental step towards incorporating Indigenous guidance in every aspect. And for that, I really respect and applaud those making that step forward. A step towards good governance, a step towards treating each other with respect and reciprocity, a step towards a governance structure that might be around in 1,000 years. Now that the agreement in principle is in place and there's a framework in place to modernize the Columbia River Treaty, what is being done to address the Indigenous guidance and leadership in every aspect, as Dr. Armstrong stressed we must do? Are there additional governance mechanisms and structures that can be incorporated in parallel with the IAP into a modernized treaty? And I do believe a lot can be added to the finalized treaty that doesn't disrupt the AIP, but does get the transboundary governance structure closer to an ethical and equitable solution to meet the moment. And so now I'm going to describe what's been coined as the Kimberly proposal. And there's actually a link to it on the conference website. If you go to the Columbia Basin, or columbiabasingovernance.org, in the middle of the page, you'll see a link for the draft proposal for transforming transboundary water governance in the Columbia River Basin. In 2019, an effort was initiated really by somebody who's important to a lot of people in this room, Kindy Gossel. And the idea was to create a space for Indigenous leaders, managers, of the Transboundary Columbia River and the University Consortium on the Columbia River governance to come together and brainstorm, to inform negotiations of the Columbia River Treaty on governance options, and to think beyond the treaty, to inform a one river, one basin approach. And I was brought in to simply organize all those ideas into a cohesive document, which is on the website, and to present that document at the 2019 Transboundary Conference in Kimberly, BC. The overarching concept of the proposal was to establish an International River Basin Organization, in shorthand IRBO, to strengthen existing governance mechanism and to operate alongside the Columbia River Treaty, to serve as an umbrella organization. And it proposed several changes to governance within the Columbia River Treaty to address the outcomes of the respective regional recommendation. First, that transboundary river governance needs mechanisms to address the lack of transparency in decision-making, and second, the need for flexibility in the face of uncertainty and climate change. And third, the inclusion of sovereign indigenous nations in decision-making. The proposal really isn't novel or extreme. As we've seen in the Danube, there's IRBOs around the world. It's being done in third world countries and even between the US and Canada and other transboundary agreements. And this proposal drew a lot of content from the Great Lakes agreements, with the addition to correct the absence of representation of indigenous peoples as sovereigns. And to rectify the historical absence of indigenous nations, we look to the Pacific Salmon Treaty that includes tribes, First Nations, states, provinces, and federal entities as co-managers. Including indigenous nations as co-equals and co-managers is not a novel concept, and it is really the only way forward towards a governance structure that might exist for thousands of years into the future. What we proposed with the IRBO model was to separate governance from management, to establish a governing body that can make value judgments, and a management body that can carry out operations as directed by the governing body. And I'll show you, oops. This is kind of what we were thinking if people think in pictures, that there would be an overarching body, an International River Basin Organization with governing entities that include the Columbia River Basin tribes and the federal governments of the US and Canada, and that there would be a citizens advisory body and an independent advisory body, and that the IRBO includes the Upper Columbia River, includes the Snake River Basin, includes the Lower River into Oregon, into Nevada, the entire basin. And I think the Kimberly proposal, and if you haven't read it, or if you read it 5 years ago, dive back into it and check it out. But I think it was an important process to inform the CRT negotiations that other options exist. And after this proposal was presented to the Kimberly Conference, we received broad support from the public attendees and the conference attendees that real transformation was needed in the existing governance structure. But here we are, 5 years later, and the agreement in principle is an incremental step towards good governance by bringing sovereign indigenous nations into the formal governance structure through the JEB. But the AIP is not proposing a transformative governance structure for the Transboundary Columbia River. And so, looking back through the CRT review process, we asked the question, what are some transformative actions that could be taken and still can be taken to strengthen governance in the Transboundary Columbia River? And some ideas are to alter the composition of the US and Canadian entities to include sovereign indigenous nations, as well as the Joint Engineering Board, and specific to the treaty, to establish a binding dispute resolution mechanism to ensure the best available science is being considered and implemented into decision making. For example, what happens if a recommendation from the JEB is denied? Formally, and three, this is a big one, to formally adopt ecosystem-based function as a co-equal priority and purpose alongside flood control and power production. And so what are the next steps? What can be included in the treaty framework that maintains the AIP and moves us closer to good governance? There are few governance mechanisms to enhance the governance structure that really doesn't actually change the balance of power in the governance structure of the Transboundary Columbia River. The CRT review process, in my opinion, has made it clear that the federal governments in Canada and the US don't really want to relinquish authority in decision making. But within this structure, how can changes to governance improve transparency and flexibility? And what can be added to the AIP that maintains the status quo governance structure but enhances transparency and flexibility? First, I think establishing an independent science advisory board comprised of representatives from the US entity, the Canadian entity, US tribes, and First Nations is a big step. Again, independent science advisory boards are not novel. Both countries implement such bodies in domestic processes. For example, in the US, the ISAB is part of the federal Columbia River power system, which just provides a check and reviews the science being incorporated to mitigate impacts to salmon. And internationally in the Great Lakes Agreement, as Glenn explained, where an independent science advisory board reviews and informs and advises managing entities. A science advisory board can also support adaptive management and assign experts to review specific operating plans as it relates to their area of expertise. Another function this can have is to be a clearinghouse for data. So data can be shared across the border, or people who aren't plugged into the entities can access that data and share research. And so secondly, I think establishing a formal citizens advisory board will also support transparency and public support of the Columbia River Treaty. And this can be done in ways that enhance a modernized treaty and not change anything major. Listening sessions organized by federal governments are great, but really don't go far enough to effectuate actual engagement and participation by river basin citizens. Again, as Dr. Armstrong told us last night, governance is how we get along and how we relate to each other in the river, how we treat each other. Without meaningful engagement of the public, there will be a continued distrust and resentment by the very people the Columbia River Treaty is intended to serve. These two proposals, an independent science advisory board and a citizens advisory board, don't take any authority away from the federal governments in power, but they do move the needle closer to good governance that promotes transparency and flexibility. And so I'll leave you with some of these questions. What can be done to enhance the AIP to address Indigenous guidance and leadership in every aspect, as Dr. Jeanette Armstrong asked us to do? How can this process move forward towards good governance or better governance? How can this basin achieve what Dr. Armstrong described, a kind of governance that has no borders, like the river itself? And how can we really institute something bigger than even a one river approach, a one basin approach, right? We have so much, there's bigger vision out there. And so to conclude, I'd like to really repeat Bishop Redberg's statement that she stated this morning. There can be no justice without righting historic wrongs. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Adam, for bringing our perspectives back home to the Columbia and for offering more detail on the Kimberly proposal and for challenging us to think about if this governance system will still be here in 1,000 years. Last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from Dr. Aaron Wolf, a water resources geographer at Oregon State, and he needs no further introduction. Aaron.
Holy moly. What do I do with these? Is it the big crayon? Got it. Awesome. So those of us who teach, we refer to this as kind of the death hour, right? So I see the blood sugar has plummeted. I see your eyes are kind of doing this. Don't worry, if you have to put your head down, take a nap, I will not be offended, I promise. It's that time of day. There we go. I'm stealing all of my slides from Susanna Schmeier, who gave the keynote on our online version of this a couple of years ago. She's camping and offline, so she doesn't know I've stolen all of them, and so don't tell her. But a bunch of us, I mean, a number of people have pointed out, we're not making up stuff that hasn't been done, right? I've been so moved by this whole meeting. Who's coming into the room, right? And the proof of the need for this is that we're the only ones doing it, right? This isn't happening under the treaty. This isn't happening under science boards. This isn't happening in the science meetings. It only happens when we decide to get together across the border and pursue the relationships that we know we have only because we're all citizens of the Columbia Basin. So what I want to do is just talk a bit about where I've seen this process move since we and my colleagues in the Universities Consortium have been doing these dialogues to kind of stop and say, you know what, we are moving forward, not fast enough or far enough, but there has been some movement. And draw on some models from elsewhere around the world that hopefully we may be able to draw on as Kinga so kindly offered to us. First of all, we know the Columbia Treaty, at the time, it was kind of cutting edge. It allocated benefits instead of water, right? That was kind of a new concept at the time. Now, unfortunately, the only benefits they considered were hydropower and flood control. And those were the two legs of the stool. The other thing I think it's worth remembering, the treaty was never meant to encompass the basin as a whole. It was how to build and manage 4 dams and the hydropower that it generated, and that was it. So when we're looking to this document to help facilitate basin-wide dialogue, we may be looking in the wrong place, and we may have to think about how do we do this ourselves. So we know it didn't have provisions for the environment, had no consultation with the tribes, and certainly no formal governance role. It had no public participation or a mechanism for adapting to change. So along our kind of 5 years of dialogue in this vehicle, these messages kept coming up, is that we collectively want those things. We want, in a wish list, a mechanism for adaptive capacity, as Adam was talking about. We want a mechanism for public involvement to facilitate dialogue and information exchange, to synthesize priorities, and to advise on basin-wide management, basically to enhance community, right? And in my kind of world, and we talked about this with the training on before the session started, in my world, I tend to think of the 4 waters that parallel our 4 prisms of existence, right? So we have our physical existence, or the physical aspects, and there's physical water that we touch, that we move. We have mental water, right, that we calculate, the crop per drop, and the price of water. And we also have emotional water, right, water tied to sovereignty and to history and to power and to justice. And we also finally have spiritual water. And I'll ask here the same question I asked the young folks a couple of days ago. How many people in this room come from a faith tradition that draws on water for spiritual transformation? Hands way up high. I'm going to ask again. Digging back, even if you didn't grow up this way, how many people in your past come from a spiritual tradition that draw on water for spiritual transformation? Those of you who don't have your hands up are lying through your teeth, because you all do. Y'all do, and this is one of the things that brings us together. And if you notice, you go to most water meetings, and they're only talking about physical and mental water, right? The stuff that you can measure, the stuff that you can calculate. But we know that it's the other waters that bring us together. How does it enhance dialogue? How does it bring us into story? How does it help our healing? How does it enhance our spirituality? These are the larger questions. And again, I would humbly suggest that maybe the treaty is not the best place to look at it. Now, I know they're making some steps, and to be fair, these are really powerful. The Kootenai Transboundary Coordination is the type of mechanism we would like to see basin-wide, right? But it's only in one place. The JEB is lovely, and as far as I know, I also went back and checked a little bit. It's the only treaty that will have a formal role for indigenous, for tribes and First Nations, I think anywhere in the world. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty close to this. And this is super powerful. But if you're not in the Kootenai, you're not Indigenous, you're not in BC, you have no voice at all. And most importantly, we're not having those dialogues together, right? So the question is, how do you do it? 800 treaties, a couple of them do touch on this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details in each of these other river basin organizations. There's a lot of reports that are out there. There's 127 river basin organizations. 43 make reference to stakeholder engagement. Most is on sharing awareness, and as we talked about in our little breakout, sharing awareness is one thing, but that's information is only flowing in one direction. We also want them to hear us, right? So we also want some kind of advisory role. It's like, look, we're in the basin. Maybe I have a degree in microphysical, hydro, geo, something or other, or maybe I'm just here and I'm a citizen, but I want to say, right? Listen to me. This stuff is important to me. These relationships are important to me. I don't have to talk about the EU or the Danube, really good stakeholder agreement. There's another agreement on the Scheldt River on the other side of Europe, which is kind of interesting in that the river has a formal representative at the table. And agreements have to be made by consensus, which means the river has to agree to anything that's being done to it. Right? It's an easy way to help allow for a lot of the kinds of things we've been talking about. The Sava is a tributary of the Danube, and they also do this really, really well. Now, this is former Yugoslavia. These are people who immediately before doing this, they were literally trying to kill each other. And they got together because of the Sava River and how it brought people together. And they have this whole elaborate stakeholder program. Again, I won't go into the details, just to point out that people in a lot of places are thinking about this. Now has 12 riparian countries, right? We got significantly fewer than that. If they can do this, we can do this. What's interesting about theirs is that the Nile Basin Discourse, it initially was made up of NGOs, and it's separate from the treaty, right? So they have a formal memorandum of understanding with the treaty, but they're not under the treaty, right? So they do a lot of stuff. They have a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach and a side-to-side approach. There's also something cool in the Nile. There's something called the Nile Project, which is musicians from each of the Nile countries, and they go up and down the river playing music to remind people how much both music and water unite us. And reminding everybody in the basin that it's all one basin, right? So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Nile Basin Discourse, they have some offshoot projects now, women in water diplomacy. Now journalists are going up and down the river. Okavango, this is in southern Africa. They have a program called Every River Has Its People, and that's really focused at the grassroots. And again, not just to hear from the governments, but to inform the governments of what they want. As with a lot of river basin organizations, they have funding issues, but it's a lovely organization that's connecting people who up until this organization really had no contact with each other. Same with the Mekong. This is a formal part of the treaty. There's 4 lower Mekong countries have a similar body and a formal process where when they come up with their 5-year plan within the treaty, they have to present it to the stakeholders, and they have to hear and listen to what the views are on the plan. Russia and China do this. I want that to sink in. Russia and China have better stakeholder engagement than we do, right? I mean, come on, we could be doing better. They have these agreements on their shared environment, and neither country is really well known for you know, stakeholder engagement. But nevertheless, this is embedded in a treaty. So how do we do it here, if we're going to do it here? One, I think we hopefully can keep doing what we're doing here. I have so loved working with my colleagues doing this, and I have so loved as this dialogue has had its continuity. It shouldn't be up to like volunteers kind of outside any kind of formal process doing this. This is something that needs funding, it needs sustainability, it needs a body, but it needs to be couched in a way that does this kind of thing, that listens to the folks in the basin. So some of the easy ways to do it. One, just expand the geographic scope of the Kootenai Transboundary Collaborative, right? It's like, great setup for the Kootenai, why not just do it basin-wide, right? So maybe call it a proof of concept in the agreement, extend out to all 3 legs, and there's a model. The other way, and it would take a bit of a stretch, but could be interesting, is expand the mandate of the JEB, right? So its mandate is to represent indigenous values, and the focus is on the environment. But what if it continued to be indigenous-led and represented the values in the basin wide? That could be really interesting, and there would be a certain historic symmetry to a model that did that. Or, as Adam was saying, maybe we just step outside of the treaty and think about what an international river basin organization looks like. If we were going to think well beyond the dams, well beyond the things that the treaty restricts itself to, what do we want, right? What do we want? And if we want it, why don't we just build it? I say just. I know. Joanne's like, no, right? It would take a lot, but maybe that is the answer. Is if we want to continue this dialogue, maybe we just have to build the organization that does it. So on that note, I just wanted to, and again, these are Susanna's concluding thoughts. I love working with her. She's got a center like ours in the Netherlands. She's literally the world's expert on river basin organizations and treaties. And so she was our keynote 2 years ago, and as we move forward, I would hope to get her back. So she mentioned stakeholder engagement's an integral part of managing water resources at all levels. Question is not whether to do it, but how. Legal and institutional basis needs to be available, and I would just add sustainable funding needs to be there, right? This group's been hustling for $10,000 here, $10,000 there to make this happen. It doesn't take much, but what it does take has to be sustainable. And then the technical and financial resources. Mostly though, I just want to appreciate that this is a community that all of us are a part of on the basis of our living in the basin itself. And it's just a joy for me to be a part of the Columbia River Basin. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to all of our speakers for your time, expertise, and care that you bring to your work. We have about 10 minutes left for questions, so I'll come down onto the floor with the microphone. If you could just raise your hand and I'll walk up to you, and then just specify if the question is to a specific panelist or to the panel at large. And also introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Miller. Thank you guys for being here, presenting your information. I personally, and maybe I speak for more, am quite moved at the power of water and what we learned today in terms of uniting people and bringing communities together, and also the necessity of that if a lot of these things are to come into being, and as well judging by the alliances that we have even created here together. My question involves maybe a fourth leg of that stool. Most of the stools I've sat on have had 4 legs. And maybe your thoughts on integrating that public participation aspect or community engagement as that 4th leg. Thank you.
I said it. I spent 20 minutes saying it. So yeah, if you all want to go ahead.
There's 4 of us, and we don't have a lot of time. Oh my. Can you hear me? There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you for that question. So in my organization, we write it into our terms, our directives, and so we make it a requirement of the work that we do, and there's an expectation that from the public that they will have an opportunity to be heard in our work. And so codifying things like that in documents and terms of reference, et cetera, for us is sort of the way it's very bureaucratic, I realize. It's the way we sort of operationalize it. We make it sort of a normal practice in what we do. And it's a two-way dialogue between us and the public. And the public is on the outside sometimes, and sometimes we have public people who are actually sitting in official capacities in our different organizations. And that's just how we put that into practice, I'd say. Yeah, like I said, it's kind of a more clinical way to go about it, but that does not detract away from the passion that people bring when they're bringing their ideas to us and how to better look after the water that we're responsible for doing so under the treaty.
Hi, Kathy Eichenberger, a resident of Victoria. 2 things. One is just a thought, having been at the table and not telling secrets out of school. I'm just concerned that if you want to go big, the whole enchilada, the entire RBO, countries are going to run away screaming in opposite directions. And I really like the commitment to the concept and then the incrementalism of, a proof of concept. But I have a question for you, Glenn, and we talked about that in the JEB committees, is decision by consensus can lead to paralysis by consensus. And how do you avoid that? That's a very active discussion that we've been having.
Thank you. This is a big question. It's something that we talk about a lot internally a lot. We have a policy on consensus-based decision-making, and there's sort of a very simple, straightforward way to define consensus, but as agreement from all parties, it may not be your first choice, but you can all live with your second choice. But consensus can also be a process of learning and growth. So if there's disagreement, what does it take to, what needs to be added to the conversation? Who needs to be included in the discussion, such that you can sort of at least find areas of commonality to move forward towards a consensus-based approach. The goal is to avoid any sort of voting at the end of the day. And sometimes that will take time to get there. And that laborious process should not only pay dividends, in coming to consensus on something, but also should be a means of relationship and trust building in getting there. That's a tall order, and it's a heavy lift for people to do, but that's my interpretation of our approach. But I think it's a very important topic, so I don't want to take too much time if others also have views on that important question, Kathy. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Conference gadgets look differently in Europe. I'm so sorry. So I would like to go back for a moment to Vanessa's question as well. I started from the very moderate end, I think, of the inclusion of the wider public. And including it as a fourth leg raises very difficult questions, I think, about whom to include, who can represent whom. And this goes to Kathy's question as well, that I can clearly see the difficulties of how to bring all those stakeholders of the wider public to the political level with decision-making capacity. So, as Glenn said, it takes a long time. It takes it takes significant effort to find out how they can work together. But what I really liked in this symposium was that many of you referred to the forthcoming period as a period of experiments, as a period of testing how stakeholders can get engaged in it. And while we try to put the meat on the skeleton of the AIP, I think there are many opportunities to consult with the wider public. And many actors are still not here. They are still not present in the room. We still cannot ask them. So like business actors, for example, possible funding donors, for example. It would be very important in this experimental period to find out what they are able and what they are willing to do in this framework. And then after this experimental period, there would be easier to draft the certain options from the very moderate one that I described with the example of the Danube strategy, which is a non-institutionalized, very soft level cooperation, doing the best what can be done, or imagining the best that can be done on that level, to the other end, what Vanessa proposes with inserting a fourth leg with public participation. So these are my thoughts about this question. Thank you.
My name is Wilson Weewa from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Oregon. I've tried to be very objective in listening for the past 2 days to all the experts that have presented their models for coming up with a plan for an effective transboundary resolution to providing water and resources, natural resources, and to the economy of both countries. And listening to you talk about, like I said, the models, and we talk about consensus and agreement, and in some ways, all your models, each of you experts have presented are good, I think, without having the time to research and read all the stuff you guys get paid to read. I wouldn't want that job, but you have presented some models that have given me things to think about. In some ways, even you guys can't come to consensus on what you guys think is the right solution to what we're dealing with now. And maybe you guys need to get your heads together, all you academics, all you scientists, all of you that have proposals for some good objective answers. Put all your wonderful models together and come back with one plan that we might be able to entertain as a unified body because certainly some tribes are at a disadvantage to not have the money to pay for somebody to do all the research in order to bring forth a model that the tribes would like to present. The question was asked about yesterday in the first group. It was asked about what's going to happen with all of our question cards that we turn in to you folks, and who's going to go through them, who's going to put them into sections, whatever, and then bring them back as a summary to whomever, maybe to us, maybe. Hopefully you guys do, the organizers of this, hopefully they do. And who's going to say, no, we can't do these ones, yes, we can do these ones, yes, these are in the middle, we need to explore some of these avenues. Are we going to get a report on all this, or have we just written on file cards just to please the organizers of this symposium? Because then you add another layer of dysfunction on something that's already dysfunctional. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Why don't you guys, academics, get together and come forth with one plan? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wilson. So I'm Jewish, and there's a saying about Jews: 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Academics are even worse. I can only tell you, and you know this. I mean, I know you know this. I can only speak from my own experience as somebody who was part of the organizers of these over the years. I don't think any of us have ever seen our roles as coming up with an answer. I think what we've seen our roles as is helping provide a venue for dialogue. And then if we do have, quote, expertise, and you know that we know that books aren't the only place you get expertise. So most of us have I've worked in all of those basins. I've been in rooms like this around the world, and it's always hard. It's always hard. There is no answer that I can walk into any room and say, here's what you all ought to do. How would it be? I mean, the whole process is, what do we want to do together? And that takes a conversation. It doesn't take an expert from outside coming up with the answer. And so and you know I've always been very straight with you when we've had conversations. I think our role is to continue to do this, to provide a place for dialogue, and then to call on the people that have the expertise. And I think we've done that over the last 2 days, and coming from a lot of different expertise, from lived experience, from traditional ecological knowledge to science backgrounds, that all of those have been valued and respected. And then to think, what are the tools or the components that would work here? I think that's all we can do, but then it's up to us collectively to figure out what do we want. I think I'll leave it there. That's just my perspective. Anybody else wants to add in? Yep.
I guess I would say one thing. I really appreciate that question and that comment. I think in past symposiums and conferences that we've had like this, we have gotten a huge amount of feedback and support. And I think it does take somebody taking that next step, right? To send out that email or make that call to to get everybody in the room again to try and come to consensus, which is hard. But it's not going to be us creating that thing. It's going to be those who are actually working on the river and doing the things. So.
I did want. What do I do? Do you guys just do this, or do I do this? You do it. Okay. Sorry.
You're supposed to leave it on.
Leave it on. Okay. I just wanted to come back, Wilson. You asked about the report. There will be a report. All those note cards, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, the note cards were meant to go to an individual, and we're making sure that they'll go to that individual, and then responses will go out to the group as a whole, as if we'd had this. But there will be a report on the meeting itself, as there have been on all of these meetings. Just, again, we're not the decision makers. We're just, and trust me, none of us are getting rich or getting famous doing this. And so we'll do our best to get stuff out as best we can.
So that is all the time that we have, so we'll conclude panel 6, but I encourage you to keep having these.
Yep.
No. Of all the issues that I'm willing to wade in, that is so not one of them, I gotta say. No, I can only say how it happens elsewhere. As you point out, there's a lot of times there's places where people disagree, people don't agree. And I think what we've tried to do here is mostly invite people in their personal capacity, right? So none of us are representing anybody. And I think that's been mostly true, especially on a lot of the panels. And so we didn't sit down and say, who is going to be represented or who isn't. We looked for individuals we knew, or we looked for people we had relationships with, and we just kind of hope that that we'd have a good conversation. I think that's it. I don't think any of us are willing to say we're expert enough in any of this to figure out how to perfectly represent everybody in the basin. So I'll just say we're. That's a question for the treaty folks. I lived for 10 years in the Middle East. I know we're not to get into minefields, man. That was a nice try, but I'm not going there. Yeah. I think my sense is it's probably a better conversation around a break, because I don't want to take away from the next panel. So why don't we do that? We're just about to break for coffee, and I'll find you and we'll chat. Awesome. Thanks. Oh, session's over. Have coffee.
I just want to thank the panel. Thank you very much. And invite you to go to the gift table on your way out and make your choice of a book and canned salmon. Certainly a very thoughtful panel session, and I think, Wilson, you sort of started to introduce the concept of what we're going to be talking about in the next panel, governance roundtable on how do we make this better from a governance point of view. So we're going to take a 15-minute coffee break. If we could be fairly succinct about that, that would be appreciated, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. It's just outside the doors. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Could we please get back to our seats so that we can start panel 6? As Aaron said earlier, we can see the energy level dropping, so I know. If we could get back to our seats, please, that would be appreciated, so we can start panel 6 and be respectful of people's time. Could I ask those that are on panel 6 to please come up to the stage and find your seats? Panel 6 speakers, could you please make your way to the stage?
Seems a little. Hey, John.
You're in the corner, Jay.
How does these things work? You push that thing?
Well, at least you don't have a hat on. Okay. Terrific. Thank you. Okay, so final panel of the symposium, the Governance Roundtable on One River. The focus of the roundtable is to jointly imagine new ways that citizens' participation can be implemented within the basin post-modernization of the treaty. A very nice segue from our last panel. As citizen participation has been limited throughout the last century, building robust mechanisms for the inclusion of diverse perspectives will be critical to ensure long-term social and ecological sustainability within the Columbia Basin. I would like to reintroduce Aaron Wolf and Henry Pitts, who will again co-facilitate this session. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we are winding down and summing up, and we have an amazing panel of experts here, and the way the organizers have organized this makes my job super easy because everybody here has been introduced already. So the idea here is each of the folks here have been with us for the last couple of days, are super thoughtful about this issue of governance in their own rights and on their own time. And so what we're asking each of them to do is just give us 5 minutes. What is your vision? What have you seen the last couple of days? What have you learned? And where do you want to go? What is your idea for how we move forward in a one river dialogue? And I want to make, the process will be this. All the way from Stan to Adam, everybody will get about 5 minutes to express their views and vision for the future. We'll pause Henry will come around again and ask for questions or comments from the floor. And then we have our 4 facilitators at the end who will then wrap up with their own 5 minutes of reflection at the end of the end of the session. The other thing I want to make clear is after these openings, everybody's speaking in their personal capacity. So a couple of folks have brought prepared text for their opening, and after that, please understand everybody who says something will be speaking in their personal capacity and not on behalf of any organization. So we'll just go all the way around the room, and Stan, would you lead us off?
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be speaking to this group on day 2 of the conference. I would like to say there's Adam and Aaron in the last group. They copied my speech. It's, I don't know what to say. And also, I'd like to mention we had a great breakfast meeting with the county commissioners at this conference this morning, and are planning to meet in the near future. A great transboundary cooperation there. Thank you. Anyway, thanks for this opportunity to share the views of the BC Columbia River Treaty Local Governments Committee on One River Governance. The committee has always supported the creation of a transboundary, basin-wide One River organization. Our 2021 recommendations stated the committee will continue to explore and stay informed about options to establish an international river basin organization with local government and resident representation for future basin-scale river management. We are encouraged by the establishment of the Kootenay Transboundary Work Group and the JEB. The uncertainty whether and how the JEB will account for the interests beyond ecosystems and indigenous cultural values leaves us wondering how these values will be accounted for in river management decisions. This is an enormous, complex basin, so creating a One River organization is going to be a huge undertaking. A first important step will be achieving an open exchange of information across the border. Hopefully that will begin to happen through the 2 new groups. Perhaps we should watch the development and actions of these new groups to learn more about how we might create a One River organization in the long term. In closing here, we greatly appreciate that in BC we have an ongoing engagement processes. While there aren't similar processes in the U.S. portion of the Columbia Basin, which increases the interest in a basin-wide organization for U.S. residents. Thank you.
You guys control everything, right? Is that right?
Okay, thank you for that. Lim, thanks for having me, Jay Johnson. I have the honor and privilege and responsibility of being at the table with my colleagues on the Canadian delegation of the CRT, as well as being involved and founding member of the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative in Canada and many other initiatives. And I thought this was a really valuable symposium, and it was a wonderful opportunity for the part of me that works on the CRT to be able to speak about it finally in a way that we are freed a little bit now because we have an EIP to talk about and to publicly discuss, which is amazing. And I just wanted to maybe flag a couple of thought points I have here. And the first in mind is that change is not easy. And it's a very, very difficult and long road. But it requires persistence and dedication. And the nation that I've helped represent and work for and been taught by, the Okanagan Nation, has taught me a lot over the years. And I continue to learn every single day. And one of those is persistence, patience, principle, tenacity, creativity, and partnership, and then collaboration too. And those are in order. And those are values. Those are also strategies, and it takes all of that in order to make the kind of changes that that we all face, that colonialism has brought, that capitalism and nation states and the international regime require and impose on us. And when we talk about the international treaty, we're also talking about how two nation states have defined their relationship to the river, but they've seen it in a particular lens, and that lens has been historically, and I mean back to the 60s, limited, very, very limited, and talking about flood control and power generation. And here we are now, 60 years later, with the opportunity, because one of those provisions expired, and there's now an incentive by a nation-state government and another nation-state government to come together and discuss what they can, quote-unquote, modernize within the treaty. And that created an opening for Indigenous nations, a space, after decades and decades of attempting to have that voice heard and replicated in the decision-making processes that were defined from above and imposed on those below, the nation-state government. And it took all those traits of the leaders and the negotiating team and our group, our technical group, and some foresight and alliances with outside members to put the pressure on governments and decision makers in Ottawa and Victoria to ensure that we had a formal place at the table. And then that table was a little bit on the side when it came to the negotiations. So then we had another battle. We have to be in the room. We have to be seen and heard. We have to be replicated. The nation's voice has to be heard front and center. And we had another fight, another battle, and we were successful. We were able to get in the room with our colleagues. We created those, reached across the mountain ranges and brought neighbors into the room. And big important things happened. But big important things happened because of alliances, collaboration, partnership, common agenda, Indigenous values, the spiritual power of the connection to the land moved us to a place. But let's be clear, we're making change to an existing power dynamic. We're not building it ourselves. So with that in mind, we're planting the seeds for a new future rather than the plant is full grown. And I'm really encouraged by that. And I just want to say something that, like, the JEB is no small thing. It's no small thing. And yes, it doesn't have decision-making power yet. Yes, we have included the need to ensure that that all citizen voices are heard as part of that process, but it must be Indigenous-led. It has to be Indigenous-led because those same power dynamics have marginalized Indigenous voices on both sides of the border since colonialism, on their own territory, on their own lands, in their own communities. And now we have an opportunity for that to start to shift. And Indigenous leaders want to hear everyone's voice because an informed decision is only good if it comes from everybody's perspective. And that's pretty much the essence of what we're trying to do. But I just also want to just maybe be a bit controversial here and just also say that if it's not Indigenous-led, then Indigenous voices are then they're diluted again and potentially marginalized. So, you know, maybe the shoe's on the other foot for a bit of a second here, but it's not. We're not replicating or attempting to replicate a top-down system by any way, any shape or form. It's just slowly building change, slowly building a new system, and we'll get there. And my only other thought was, from the last panel, none of those strategies are mutually exclusive. So I would encourage all of those strategies. Lim-limt. Thank you.
Thanks for that. That's lovely. I can't. when I see, I'm sorry, when I see the title bishop, I gotta say bishop, and she corrected me. She said, no, call me Gretchen. That's what God calls me. So I'm gonna force myself. Gretchen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So 1,700 years ago, the Christian church made a tragic mistake, and we got married to secular power with the conversion of Constantine and the conversion of the Roman Empire, conversion being actually the co-option of the church. And we've been paying for that ever since. And we forget, as followers of Jesus, that the ultimate power, we believe, of the universe is best demonstrated in self-sacrificial love and in washing another's feet. And so when the church today is starting to say things like, we actually need to prioritize Indigenous voices because we failed to do so earlier. And I wish that every church was saying this, and I wish that we were better at it, right? But when I think about what do we need to do, the first thing we need to do as a church, and speaking for myself and my own people, is we need to remember that we say, love God, love your neighbor, which is actually a Christian scripture that's quoting a Hebrew scripture, right? And that if love can be commanded, it's not a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's actually an action. And so how do we love in a way that follows the way of Jesus? We serve. We give up power. We self-sacrifice for the sake of the other. And so I think part of it is to say whose voice is not at the table. And if they're not there, why am I here? Right? How do I step down and give my voice away to somebody else who needs to be here more than I do? Because their voice hasn't been heard. I also think there's a line that I love. I would tell you who said it first, but I don't know, which is, there is no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. And so I think to myself, how do I work in such a way that it's not about me getting the credit? Right? And I also talk to folks about how privilege needs to speak to privilege. Right? It is not my job as a woman to try to convince men that patriarchy is bad. It's the men's job. And it is not the Indigenous folks' job to try to teach me as a white person that the suppression of Indigenous folks was bad. Right? It's not their job, right? Or any person of color. It's our job. So I need to speak from my place of power in the church to the people who have power, and I need to speak to white folk, and I need to speak to women, and I need to speak to people who my privilege can speak to theirs, right? And if we do that, if those of us who care about it do that in that way, so a simple example, my diocese owns land on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Right, so how do I, as a bishop, speak to the governor of Idaho, who happens to call himself an Episcopalian, right, to say, hey, this is what you should be doing as an Episcopalian. You just happen to also be a governor. How does privilege speak to privilege? To invite us in to see the needs that exist. And then how do we do it in a way that is true to whoever it is we're talking to? So if you're a businessman, speak to the businessmen in ways or women that help them understand and speak their language. Farmers speak to farmers, right? How do we do that? I think we need to really commit to that. And I think we also need to commit to understanding that for a lot of people, this is new. Like I said, this was my first conference. It has been amazing to learn. I'm glad I'm not under the expert line, because I'm not, right? But what I know is, once you know, you can't go back. Right? So how do you move forward in a way that invites other voices in, other people in? How do I share what I've learned in a way that others can do the same? Let's not keep it in the room. I think that's the other big important thing. And then really just saying to people in power, authority is granted and can be taken away. How do we remind people of that? So anyway, I'll stop.
So I'm going to come at this in the role I actually am, and I'm a locally elected public servant. And I said that purposefully. I'm not elected to have a lot of power. I'm here to serve. And sometimes electeds need to be reminded of that, and sometimes appointed folks need to be reminded that they fall under the authority of those that are elected to serve. I wrote a few notes here, and by the time I got done, my card was completely filled up, but on the governance structure. And I've had to do a lot of planning as a local elected, both land use, forest issues, different issues related to that. And one of the things I'm going to share with everybody is don't try to put everything in the treaty. It doesn't need to be all-encompassing. As a local elected official in the state of Washington, I am actually granted the authority to do anything that is not prohibited by law. That is, if you think about it for a minute, that's a huge responsibility. I can do anything that's not prohibited by law. The treaty can be looked at the same way. So when I hear folks talk about public participation and not having a seat at the table or not being the decision maker, sometimes I would like you to reflect for a minute and say, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's a good thing. I also want to say public participation, and I realize I want to speak to this public participation. I'm not talking about the First Nations or the tribes. I'm talking about the public. There's a lot of forms of public participation. Early on, we had listening sessions that the entities did, and people would ask questions. Well, in a listening session, they're there to listen. They're not there to answer your questions. So how you frame public participation is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how you come at it is also difficult. I know that I reflect back, and I will tell you that not very many people were involved in the Columbia River Treaty or even thought about it or said anything about it until it was coming up for negotiation. Now all of a sudden everybody's really wanting to have their voice heard. That's a great thing. But what I fear is in public participation is that the minute the treaty is finally ratified, that voice of folks that really want to have their voice heard goes away. So if you truly want public participation, you have to give of yourself and your organization to commit to stay at the table to get those changes. And as a local elected, I will tell you, you don't find very many people that actually want to do that. And the folks that do are generally very heard. We hear you. The other thing I want to say about participation is a lot of times it's not what you want, it's how you say it. You have to leave the baggage that you have for wrongs that were done in the past at the door. And that is an extremely hard thing to do. Extremely hard thing to do. But you have to focus, if you want to succeed, you have to focus on what is it we're trying to get done, not what happened in the past. I can't, as a local elected official, I can't fix what previous commissioners did or current other bodies did. I can only improve things going forward. So we need to focus on that aspect. Another thing I wrote down on my card here was we look at the Columbia River Basin, and yes, we talk about one river, but I also don't want folks in this room to forget how we are still tied to all the other watersheds around. I had a presentation that I was at on the Colorado River, and I came back and I asked that presentation to be done to our caucus, local caucus of local government. And the reason I did is because had situation not improved in the Colorado River, and it's not totally improved yet, that affects our basin in the Columbia River. We are still all tied together, whether we like it or not. So if you really want to fix a problem, blow it up. And I don't mean with dynamite, I mean look at the bigger picture. I think that's what needs to be done. And if I can't leave this group with any other message, being a local elected official, I encourage you to listen. It's very hard to do. We all like to talk. I know as a local elected official, I get told a lot I'm talking, probably talking too much now. But the reality is, listen. And that means sometimes stepping back from where your comfort zone is and try and put yourself in the other person's shoes. If you want good governance, you have to try and put yourself in the opposite shoes, regardless of what the structure is. Because if you truly listen, that's when you truly can make good decisions. Thank you.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here again, and thank you for including me in this panel. I have two tasks, though. I also have to, I've been asked to read a brief note from Living Lakes Canada, which has been a steadfast participant in this type of dialogue for many years. It's an NGO, environmental NGO, based in the Upper Columbia Basin, but is international in scope. So it's from Kat Hartwig, the Executive Director. To those of you who don't know us, Living Lakes Canada is a water stewardship NGO working to advance watershed security in the Columbia Basin and other watersheds across Canada for more than 2 decades. Our community-based integrated framework for adaptive watershed management in the Columbia Basin has been recognized as a case study for a paradigm-shifting model articulating the need for collaborative regional problem solving supported by both Indigenous knowledge and Western science. We are long-standing supporters of dialogue in the Columbia Basin around integrated water governance, including participation in the past few years, governance and ethics symposiums as participants and panel speakers. We are unable to attend this water governance and ethics symposium. We can, while we are unable to attend, we can represent grassroots water stewardship groups in passing along a message to symposium attendees. Here's the message. We continue to advocate for the need for integrated water governance. However, the significant gap between the application of on-the-ground monitoring and restoration work and dialogues about applied water governance has remained unchanged for years. The climate crisis, as it relates to adaptive water management strategies and maintaining the health of ecosystems upon which we depend, requires an urgent paradigm shift toward holistic problem solving, which includes removing silos. NGOs can and do facilitate the breaching of silos in our mandate for collaborative and applied problem solving while advocating for watershed health. Due to the limited resources available to our sector, we are required to be very intentional in our participation in various initiatives. This means a focus on dialogues that directly benefit our work, such as the Canadian Water Agency and Canadian Water Data Strategy, the BC Water Leaders and Water Funders Coalition, the BC Watershed Security Coalition, and the like, quite a number. With regard to the current symposium, we feel we are adequately represented through our membership in the Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative. It will be very helpful to learn how the symposium outputs will be synthesized with a mandate to inform applied policy toward watershed health and adaptive, holistic water management and ethics. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. So that's from Living Lakes Canada. There you go. And now from the Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative, you'll hear from me a little bit more. In preparing a few comments for this governance panel, we decided to focus on how changes in governance could support improved ecosystem function within the basin. And given the overwhelming influence and reach of the CRT, we believed it was best to build on openings related to the CRT. And although the CRT is generally a top-down instrument, bottom-up structures can be added and built into it, and perhaps modifying the top-down structures. So I hope you see signatures of that in the comments. And just to say, there will be echoes of what we've already heard, especially in the former panel. So there's a sort of a brief summary on the slide if you get lost. But the first area is linked sub-basin dialogues. Decentralizing the dialogues following sub-basins would be helpful, carefully nested, and well-coordinated. I think we've heard that. And international sub-basins have different requirements. And we have our international sub-basins within our Columbia Basin, you know, the Pend d'Oreille, the Kootenay, Okanagan, et cetera. And we see the opportunity to build on collaborative elements. I think we've heard a lot about that now with the JEB and the KTCW. And lastly, within this first area, representatives from the sub-basins can logically link to the Columbia Basin, possibly through the existing governance structures that could be modified, the Permanent Engineering Board, et cetera, providing an effective role for institutions to speak to ecosystem function and other aspects. Now, the next two speak to voices and participation, and I think it's self-evident to everyone in this room that the respect for Indigenous knowledge and decision-making is just a crucial foundational component of an improved governance arrangement, and we're clearly experiencing that, thankfully. Well, UCBEC would add to that an expanded role is needed for Indigenous nations with stronger mechanisms for Indigenous knowledge to influence dam operations and reservoir management, and I think we've heard many calls for that too. And you know, while enhancing Indigenous roles, fostering cooperation and joint decision-making between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous community is an area of growth and curiosity. How could we do that? You know, I hear Jay's comments about it must be Indigenous-led, and I support that personally. But where and how will the non-Indigenous voice be integrated? These are questions. And then broader public engagement and education, bringing in a greater diversity of public interests can be helpful and is needed to contribute to decision-making. And supporting meaningful support, providing meaningful support for public education around Columbia Basin management is quite sorely needed within the broader community. The last 2 points then, applied adaptive management. We've talked about adaptive management a lot, and collaborative adaptive management processes and climate change planning are needed to bring EF outcomes into dam operations. And then we can't be empowered if we don't have accessible information and increased transparency. The processes are fine, but if we don't have greater equal access and transparency, we're debilitated. So a call to that as well. So in wrapping up, UCBEC holds that these types of governance mechanisms would bolster progress in improving ecosystem function without requiring a complete overhaul of governance in the treaty, and it may be able to work within the form and structure of the Modernized Treaty. So we can work with what we've got, and I would say do better. And the other aspect of this is that it can be incremental. I think that's a really, really important point, and I think we're all dealing with, to some degree, wanting more change at once, and what is the increment that we can accomplish now, knowing that there'll be other increments in the future. So we've heard proof of concept. That could be a way we go forward. And I think, you know, speaking to that issue of paralysis of consensus, I think if we had more consensus, we would learn that people are very reasonable. People are very reasonable, and they know when, most of us, I think, know when to pull back and say, okay, that decision can go forward now. And we'll only learn that by trying it, though. And so lastly, I think improved dialogue at different scales will ready us for the climate change impacts if they continue or to be more severe than expected. And it's a bit about changing a culture of listening and participation. So thanks very much for listening.
Sorry, give me a minute. There's a little presentation that I'm going to be essentially running through because it's way too long for the time I want to speak. But let me start from, can we put it, yeah? Okay. So let me start just from presenting myself, introducing myself. I'm Giusto Medeo Boccheni. I'm a doctoral candidate at McGill in my 4th year now. And I've come here also thanks to the North American Youth Parliament for Water, in which I'm acting as a membership coordinator since the beginning of this academic year. I'm very grateful to Aaron for presenting me as a member of a panel of experts. I really don't think I am. So when I come to you today, I come as a student, a person that is interested in the river, a settler that has lived in Montreal, on the territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for the last 3 years, and that knows very little about everything that is around them, but is very willing to learn a lot. So coming here was a great opportunity to start doing that, more in depth. Actually, the next slide has a little bit of the pathway I followed. As soon as I arrived a week ago to start familiarizing myself with the river, I arrived in Portland. I went back to Astoria, and then I've driven all the way through the gorge and up to the Grand Coulee Dam to then come back here. And, you know, as I was going through these places and I was listening to the stories of the people that live here, I was thinking about what am I doing here? Why have I been studying for the past 6 years or so this river, and why have I decided to make it part of my dissertation? And listening to Janet Armstrong yesterday, I was thinking, you know, maybe this sort of unrooted approach is part of my heritage. Maybe this thing of going to another place and starting to think about other things as if I could really understand them is part of the culture that raised me. And, you know, what I do is essentially think about international legal theory and legal theory in general, which has indeed very much an heritage rooted in Western thinking that tends to be imperialistic, let's say, epistemologically speaking. So next slide has an expression of these international legal principles that arise from essentially what is an history of international law that is rooted that has been written initially, especially by corporations, empires, and states. And as such, these principles reflect a state-centered order. The interesting thing about water, though, is that water doesn't care much about boundaries. And even in international law, even though it starts from a very state-centered perspective, this emerges very clearly in the practice of international law. So the community of interest that you see there at the bottom is an emerging principle of international customary law that has been used as you're going to see in the next slide, in a number of decisions, or has been sort of defined to a degree throughout them, as well as in scholarly work and some legal instruments about water. The community of interest remained very state-centered, but the interesting thing about it is that instead of using the state territory or the nation-state territory as the unit for it all, actually, if we can go back to the previous slide, that will help a bit to clarify in the previous, sorry. Yeah. The interesting thing is that it uses the body of water as a unit instead of the state. And so what happens is that riparian states are asked to cooperate and to use the body of water according to the principle of international law as if they were, on the same level because of the water that they share. So this is quite disruptive in general in international law. Not that sovereignty as state-based has been, uncontested for most of its history. And actually, this is because it comes from a previous history that was not state-based. And I'm going to skip a few slides here, but if we can get to slide 7, you can see some of the ways in which international law has been trying to cope, for instance, in the case of indigenous peoples, with ideas that pre-existed it. Ideas that nations are sovereign beside their status as states. And international law has been trying to cope with this somewhat badly. So if you look at any given side of international law today, and we can take, for instance, heritage law as an example, you can notice that the state-centered principles are still struggling to make sense of any other kind of power that is not state-centered, and a sort of history that brought it there. So I'm sorry to skip between one slide and the other, but if we can get to number 5. Thank you. So when we talk about the community of interest, and we have states as the main actors within this community, as the principle emerges, what I've been noticing is other things come into focus, because the integrity of water goes beyond the state boundaries. And so when we say community of interest, other kinds of communities tries to enter from the back door. And this can be, communities of resources. They can be communities of heritage, as we mentioned earlier, of concern, of nations. But really, the most important one that comes forward is the community of land and waters, is the hydrogeological reality of rivers and the cultural and social reality that makes up who lives in the river. And let's say that the question that I'm asking when I look at the AIP is how much in the renovation of the treaty this kind of communities are reflected. And the sensation is, the perception is that the JEB, for instance, are a good step forward. But still, and I'm very glad that Wes mentioned responsibility earlier, we got to ask ourselves, where is sovereignty here? Where is the sovereignty of indigenous sovereign nations? And is this, a sharing of responsibility beside a sharing of a discussing framework? Is there, this is not very present in North America, but in South America, free, prior, and informed consent is an increasingly necessary requirement for things to be. And just recently, I've read another law that was passed in Colombia for the Rancheria River, recognizing the rights of the river and establishing bodies that are not so different from JEBs, that are composed of indigenous peoples living along the river, but also that put together with them local actors and state actors to discuss things and give recommendations. But if these recommendations are not binding, then we're having we're not having really free, prior, and informed consent, and we're still having a state-centered sovereignty order. And moreover, if indigenous peoples, has happened so often in so many fields of international law, still are bundled together with other kind of communities, then we're sort of diluting what the sovereignty of indigenous people really is. And this is all without considering the epistemological difficulties of integrating other kinds of sovereignties. Yes, sorry, I'm almost dead. Which, in the case of the Columbian River that I just mentioned, is sort of more addressed. In the Wanganui River case that was mentioned earlier in New Zealand, it's made a forefront preoccupation. But here for the Columbia, it's never really been on the table. And this could apply to the river, but it could apply to the salmon. And perhaps a question that we can ask going forward, and that's been asked over and over again, is like, why are we not trying to make the salmon and the river, as indigenous nations have been asking, more of a partner to this decision rather than just an afterthought? And the third leg of the stool, which is an improvement nonetheless. But thank you for listening to my blabbering, and I'm just going to pass to the next speaker.
Thanks a lot. You know, this has been such a rich symposium and conversation. I've learned a lot this afternoon's conversation, the expertise that's in this room that was reflected in the keynote last night, and the experts with experience and around governance and citizen participation is, I mean, there's tremendous resources here, and I'm grateful for you all for that learning opportunity. I want to say a few things. Some will echo what's been said earlier. I think I want to thank Kathy for being here for 2 days, and her colleagues. And I think it's relevant for this conversation that the decision makers and leaders are here with a lot of people who aren't in that august circle to, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. To listen and to learn. And I will just say I wish that members of the U.S. negotiating team representing, oh, wonderful. Say again? I agree. Oh, okay. I thought you were saying they're here, and that was a surprise. It would, for the reasons that you're here and the learning and listening and sharing and accessibility, it would benefit them. And it would benefit outcomes over time. So I just want to express that gratitude. I want to say I'm not an expert on basin organizations. I'll just reiterate, there's a tremendous amount of expertise in here. And even if we don't all agree and know exactly right now what that should look like, I'll make a couple suggestions. One is just sort of, again, repeating what some others have said. The treaty has been, is certainly more in the U.S., but in both countries, a top-down approach for a very long time, and that's wrong. And it's led to bad outcomes over time. There's some progress in that regard to improve on that. I see it more, honestly, in B.C. than in the U.S., so that the issue of incremental change is a challenging one to think about. You know, who defines what the increments are and what's possible and what's fast enough and what's needed? I can't answer that, but I'll just say that the persistence and patience is a good thing, and impatience is too, and I don't know how to strike that balance. There's a need for an international river basin culture or organization or movement that I sort of think about it in two ways. Again, people have talked about lots of these elements. There's sort of the larger basin context that we haven't fostered very well. In other words, the non-indigenous people of the U.S. But there's lots of sort of fostering of relationships that can occur that's very beneficial. There's education, there's collaboration, there's building a sense of place, there's problem solving, there's seizing opportunities, all those kinds of things that can help individuals, help communities, help outcomes over time, and help the river and the health of the basin and its fish and wildlife. So that's a benefit and a plus of these kinds of things. I also think in the Columbia Basin, and others have said this, there needs to be greater information sharing. Again, getting at the top-down approach. One of the reasons people haven't been involved in this process over time up until recently is because it's been a black box that hasn't welcomed anybody or provide access. And so I'm hopeful that moving forward, those points of access are robust and grow over time, and so people can be involved. They can see the information. There's transparency. They can provide input. They can observe processes in profound ways that haven't occurred to date. And I think that this sort of organization or movement could do both those things. It's the larger context of building a sense of place and community and relationships in the basin that can create great benefits over time, you know, consistent in many ways or inspired by Dr. Armstrong's comments last night, in my view. And then there's the application to the treaty and its implementation over time that becomes more inclusive and more responsive, and we actually take advantage of adaptive management, which you know, has a checkered history, at least in my experience in the U.S. That's often used for not now or down the road sometime. So, you know, holding those processes to account, helping them reach their potential over time is going to take us participating. I will say, I think that to conclude, I think that the two nations should make a commitment over the next 20 years with financial support that's robust, that can help the people of the basin undertake this conversation to figure out, to Mr. Wiwa's comments we don't know right now, we can't decide here, but over time, with resources, we could make progress on that. That's based on conversations and input and trying to figure out how we in the basin, I don't live in the basin, but how the people of the basin could do better over time. And I feel like that kind of commitment of resources, a few $1,000,000 a year to help drive dialogue, build relationships, that sort of thing, could be incredibly helpful, and I will argue could be part of the commitment on the part of the two nations as part of this next stage in the spirit of experimentation and steady improvement over time. And maybe I'll make a final comment, and I apologize. It's about small d democracy. In the U.S., we just had an election that I think is a reflection of the kinds of things that can occur when people aren't talking to each other and building relationships and working together. And I think top-down approaches don't work very well over time for healthy democracies and societies. And I would argue that in doing so, in a kind of commitment on the part of the basin or the two nations to this kind of activities in the basin, you could be taking in a small way an investment and a recognition of the value of that kind of interactive relationship building across a basin over time that has small d democracy benefits, in addition to a whole lot of others that are important to everyone in this room. I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
I have slides. Should I come up to the podium or do I? Oh. I'll just look through.
Green button, push it, put you forward.
This one? Oh, this one. Oh, the big green button.
Keep bumping into each other. Yeah.
Well, I just want to build a little bit on the walking tour of Spokane Falls, or as Cindy Pierce might call it, the hypothermia tour. I moved here in 1983 to do my residency in internal medicine, intending to continue my work in third world medicine. And I'd worked in mission hospitals, ended up working in mission hospitals in Thailand and Kenya. And dealing with a series of issues, I ended up not pursuing a work in infectious disease. And so kind of how we ended up getting to the One River Ethics Matter project is kind of a step-by-step approach, but is grounded in the really dark days of the AIDS epidemic and my 25 years running the AIDS program here for the VA. And and dealing with trying to improve end-of-life care and the writing and piloting and launching of the POLST, or physician orders for life-sustaining treatment, to improve end-of-life care in Washington State. And then, thinking about and kind of coming out of the series of really pressing environmental issues here during the 1980s and 90s, the transition years, the massive overcutting, the mine waste issues that Cash talked about this morning, the revelation of the poisoning of the kids, up in the Silver Valley, the highest lead levels ever recorded in kids. So, all of that, and as I was doing my work in medical ethics, thinking about how can we improve the quality of ethical decision making with our environmental conflicts. And so that began the Bedside to Streamside project. I served as physician advisor for the VA's Camp Chaparral in the closed area of the Yakima Reservation, so kind of listening to the stories of Indian combat vets and working with them on traditional healing practices kind of helped lay the groundwork for the work that we do now. And of course, I was just carrying the suitcase for my wife when I went to the Universities Consortium meeting in Paulson in 2012, so here I am, and this is the price I get for carrying my wife's suitcase. So this is the One River Ethics Matter. I work particularly with Tom Soldner, who worked in Namibia and South Africa during some of the dark days of apartheid, and from that kind of, the firsthand work with Truth and Reconciliation, and that's part of our work. So the medical ethics, Truth and Reconciliation, and the Columbia River Pastoral Letters work for the Roman Catholic Church. So, this is Virgil Seymour and I went up. We had lunch with Jeanette in Penticton, but we also met with our Anglican Archbishop John Privet and Roman Catholic Bishop John Corveau to lay the groundwork for the conference, the One River Ethics Matter conference in Revelstoke in 2017. Virgil was commenting that he felt kind of weak when we on that trip, and he died a few months later from leukemia. I've always been distressed at the number of indigenous leaders who seem to be dying from cancers, and in a watershed where we have some really serious toxics problems. So I guess, thinking about what Virgil said to me as we were heading north, the river is sacred. People will put aside their differences to heal the river and bring back the salmon. And thinking about the films this morning, I think what Virgil would say here today, if I could channel Virgil, is one river, one voice. One river, one voice. So this is just a slide about the Columbia River Treaty and its purposes. My fear is that we still have just two primary purposes in the AIP. So we've undertaken kind of in the wake of the conference in Polson in 2012, we did a number of things. We put together the Columbia River Treaty Roundtable, convening a meeting in November of 2013, the American NGO Treaty Caucus. Martin and Greg and Jerry Nelson and others are already working together north of the border. We put together a Sierra Club team to do work on the international boundary work, and then we undertook this series of conferences that really intended to provide, to hand the talking stick to tribal leaders, faith leaders, and academics to try to have a dialogue about the past and future. And so that was just the listing. This is our 11th annual conference. We've joined with the Universities Consortium on Columbia River Governance and North American Youth Parliament for Water. So just some of the points here. So I guess the point here is that, and this kind of comes out of my work with Henry Saijon and others during the 1990s, dealing with the power of the mining companies and the congressional delegation from Idaho. It was really, I mean, it was really tough times. And Councilman Matheson talked a little bit about it, just what, you know, they faced, the tribal leadership, and challenging this incredible entrenched power, these, you know, lords of yesterday. I think about just the leadership of the indigenous sovereigns in dealing with a genocidal past and a climate change future, and how much you know, it's kind of like what DR talked about. It's for the benefit of all, but they have put it all on the line, and in not only in protecting the tribal interest and the tribal kids, but in doing so, they also have stepped up to really represent the public interest. And really, my hat's off to them. Having watched, I mean, we thank the Kalispel tribe. I interviewed the tribal chairman. Some of these tribes nearly went extinct by the turn of by the early 1900s. In 1960, for the Kalispels, a little tiny reservation up on the Pundaree River, they had one telephone. Today, they're one of the largest employers in Spokane County, and if you flew in, that big tall building was their casino. But I mean, talk about pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And here they are taking their funds and putting them into natural resources to try to bring back the salmon. I mean, what a heroic thing. So, this is really, so I guess to follow my slides, I've already talked about the work of the One River Ethics Matter project brings together really three traditions and three processes. One is the consultation process that we use in our ethics consultation committees in the hospitals. A second is a transformative process of the Roman Catholics Columbia River Pastoral Letter, and the third is a healing process of the Truth and Reconciliation process. And that it was really kind of the work, Tom and me working with the folks that put together the Pastoral Letter. And so, just briefly, and just as at the bedside, we work to improve the quality of ethical decision-making, so too should we do this at the stream side, and decisions that we make about governance going forward really should be ethics-based in structure. So what are those? Justice, that burdens and benefits are equitably shared, that we need to right historic wrongs. And also I think intergenerational theft is key here, and that's, I think, having youth involved is important. A second is stewardship, caring for creation. We've talked about that. And a third is this issue of surrogate decision-making. I deal with this every day in the emergency department when I have a patient who comes in from the streets or, who lives alone, elderly, maybe demented, and who speaks for them? I don't speak for them. And so my challenge is to find out who speaks for them. And that gets to this principle, ethical principle of autonomy. And I would argue that burden, because it is a burden, it is a responsibility, that responsibility rests with the indigenous peoples of this basin, because they know the salmon. We've heard that repeatedly through this conference, and they are committed. So I would say, as we look at moving forward, who speaks for the salmon, and really in many ways who speaks for the future, are the indigenous people through their sovereigns. And we should not lose sight of that. So I know I'm over time, but ethics is key. I mean, it's key at the bedside, it's key when I take care of my patients, and it's key when we take care of sick watersheds, and that's what we're faced with here. And so we need to keep in mind the ethical principles that should become the underpinnings of governance structure. Thank you.
So, yeah, following that's a little tough here. Get a little emotional and worked up and ready to kick some you-know-what here. Just bring them salmon home. As sovereign nations, it's frustrating with the federal government and how that's interpreted or how that's looked at times. When it's convenient, we're sovereign. When there's issues on the table that we need to deal with or need to be a part of, we're set aside or we're put under the eye of our federal faithful trustee. The Department of Interior or the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the ones who's supposed to be taking care of us. So, history will show that hasn't been very good for us or for our resources, our salmon. When Cooley Dam was built, the tribes weren't even told about it. Weren't even involved, weren't even asked if we would have any issues or concerns with it. Some of our tribal elders at the time thought they were being punished because the salmon didn't show up, and they had no idea why. And ceremonies and things were done around that, again, without that federal trustee even informing us that what they were actually doing to us and what they were doing to the river. They asked Canada if they had any issues with building a dam at Grand Coulee there, and Canada said, no, we don't have any issues with that. We're worried about the commercial fishery at the estuary. Well, if we don't got fish going above Grand Coulee, what the hell is going to happen to the fish in the estuary? And where are we at right now? They're not. It didn't happen. And, I'm sorry, I get a little emotional and worked up and just frustrated again with the games being played and all the money being spent on not doing what's right. If we would just spend half the money we are on fighting some of this stuff by folks, we could get the salmon home. It's not going to be that big of a hit on our economy. It's going to be a boost. It's not going to be that big of a hit for our environment. It's going to be a boost. So I have issues with this whole process. The State Department didn't even have a trust responsibility policy, and they're representing us as our trustee, protecting our interests. Well, again, you can see where that's led us over the last 100 years. This third leg of the stool I find very, very interesting. Power, blood control, and ecosystem function. And we've had issues constructing this stool, and I think we're still having issues with that third leg. That ecosystem leg still seems to be a little bit short compared to the other two. So, until we level this out, until we start to look at this thing more as a whole, flood risk management, power production, irrigation, navigation, recreation, we got to throw those natural resources in there. Remember what that river was put there for. Remember why it's there, and what we've done to it in the development. There's issues, but again, we're under current circumstances. We're in situations where we're trying to bring the salmon home without negatively impacting those other issues as much as possible. There's going to be some impacts, but we all got to give a little in correcting this historic wrong. And the treaty is an opportunity, and folks have asked me, what can we do to help? And being here today is a big help. Hearing from folks, learning these issues, going out and talking to your family, to your friends, to your local politicians, your county commissioners, your mayors, those folks who are on the ground talking to those constituents, those people that these things impact and benefit on a regular basis. That's where we start. And we start to correct those historic wrongs, building those relationships, forming those bonds, talking about what could be and what can be. And stop looking back. Stop thinking that we can control Mother Nature. We can block floods. We can, all of these things we think we can do. You look across the climate change. You look across the country right now. I bet there isn't a spot in the U.S. you can't look at that's either under a drought, who's being flooded, or who's got a hurricane, or whatever the heck's going on. That is 2 or 3 times more than they usually are or used to be. So we've got a lot of big issues out in front of us that we need to deal with. And I said it earlier, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us. And we've got to set our differences aside and remember what the hell we're all here for. It's those future generations. It's those folks we haven't met yet. It's my great-granddaughter. And I'm going to do everything I can while I'm here to ensure that she and they have those things that were taken from us with the development of the Columbia River Hydro System. So, again, appreciate you guys all being here today. And thank you very much.
Going to continue on straight through, and if there is time at the end, we'll open up for questions. But
okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. Thank you for this very moving and intriguing and emotion-stirring discussion here. I just would like to add 2 points, 2 ideas, a short-term one and a long-term one. And for the short-term one, I would like to go back to the issue of citizen engagement and education, because I like to mention the two together. So yesterday, Joseph Bogart had a very interesting sentence, which I noted down. He said that only existing groups can take the funding money in terms of citizen engagement. And I think it is a very important thought, and it has not been emphasized enough in the open panels. So I believe that there is a task there as well. And of course, not everything should come into the treaty. We cannot have a 1,000 pages long treaty at all. But we are talking about the implementation as well. We are talking about the responsibilities of the newly established bodies and so on. And I think this is why it is important to say that the coordination of existing initiatives, to make them visible for funding and to make funding visible for them, is also very important in the implementation and in finding the relevant tasks for the new bodies. Because in terms of citizen engagement, we have actors which have smaller opportunities, which are not even aware of their opportunities. And there are other actors who take bigger chunks from the pie. So balancing developing citizen engagement on the grassroots level and finding synergies among them is an important task as well, which we shouldn't forget. Yes, it doesn't come to the treaty, but if in this circle we don't discuss this matter, then I cannot really imagine how they can be linked together with the river in the one river approach. So that's the first idea that I have. And the second idea is about a long-term coordination and long-term synergies. So we were talking about an international river basin organization, and I concluded that on the short term, it's not something that is very likely. But on the other hand, there is this community here, and I can see that there are already historical, very significant steps are made based on the work that you are doing here for decades already. So the JEB and the Kootenai Working Group are precedents, and they can make the Columbia River Treaty a meaningful model treaty again for other river basins all over the world, and it's very important. And as I watch this community here, as I'm having discussions with you, as I'm listening to the panels, I am quite sure that, and I use the words of Troy Hunter from the movie In the Morning, so I believe that if this community want to dream of an IRBO, and it is willing to cooperate and develop coordination together, then I'm sure that you can also achieve it on the long run. And well, thanks for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you. In listening to everyone speak, I think there is broad consensus. I think everybody's on the same page that we want more people talking and building relationships and showing up consistently. And when you bring more people into the fold to create change, whether that's slowly and incrementally or impatiently, as was stated, when you have more people working on something from different approaches at different levels, fighting different battles and different fights to either get to the table or to blow up the table, that's how it happens, is having people together to create dialogue and to realize that even if it's cheesy, we do all have a lot more in common. And I think by creating forums to bring people together around a river, and everybody has very different experiences on the river or with the river, both historically and today, that's a commonality and a starting place. And I don't think anybody here disagrees that having more people involved and aware of what's going on is a bad thing. And I think that's a great starting place.
Okay, I love these microphones where you just start talking and there it is. That's great. Okay, well, this is all really like so very interesting. And is Wilson still here? Oh, goodness, Wilson. I want to answer your question, Wilson. Well, I'll answer it anyway, because I think it was a great question. It was like, why aren't you academics up here agreeing on something? But I think all the academics up here and a lot of other people, probably every single person in the room, Kathy, is Kathy still here? All the people I want to talk to have gone already. I think the one thing everybody actually does agree to as a recommendation is we need that fourth leg of the stool. As you're still here, thank you. That fourth leg of the stool. Okay, so the third leg is kind of a little short, but we kind of got the ecosystem function thing in there about what we really need. Kathy, you're not here to hear this. What we really need is that fourth leg. We need a committed funding stream and system of bringing together everybody for these kinds of dialogues at least once a year.
More often.
More often, okay. But where I want to go next is to actually ask, okay, so what is going on here? We have a stool with 2 legs, and we're trying to put a third, maybe a fourth, and who knows how many others there. But I'm going to challenge this metaphor a little bit because, okay, let's say we have right now, for sure, what we have is a stool with 2 legs. So what is the stool itself? What is the 2 legs propping up? What is it we're sitting on? And I think when you answer that question in the way I've come to answer it through the research I've done through these kinds of dialogues over a period of over 10 years now, a short time compared to some of your involvement, what that seat is, that those 2 legs were there to prop up, is called settler colonialism. So let's start there. And as soon as you say the Columbia River Treaty is all about settler colonialism, then all of a sudden you can't say it's about hydropower and flood control, which is what we all tend to say. But I like to say, no, that's not true. It's settler colonialism. And one of the main instruments of settler colonialism was the irrigation system, that 1 million acres in the Columbia Basin project area that came immediately after Grand Coulee. So you have Grand Coulee, number 1. You have the Banks Lake and the Columbia Basin project area, stage 2. CRT is just stage 3 of the same process. So if we're trying to put more legs on a stool that's all about settler colonialism, maybe that's not actually the way to go. Maybe we need to get rid of the whole stool. Well, okay, I'm a Canadian, so we don't tend to throw out things like that, actually. Even if it's settler colonialism, it's like maybe it's got some use somewhere, well, at least for firewood maybe. But actually what I want to say more seriously is this question keeps coming up. Okay, IRBO, let's do it. Let's have a commission. Let's have it right now. Or, well, we can go step by step, and JEB can turn into something, and KCTW can turn into something. So maybe this is a bit of a joke, but maybe it's actually something of interest, and that is the difference between Canadian history and U.S. history. And I'm talking about settler colonial history, though. You know, in the United States, you had a revolution in 1776, and you have a constitution all of a sudden, that rewriting of the rules, whereas Canada took another 90 years for us to become a nation. However, we were a nation that still were actually tied in our legal systems to Great Britain, and we have only very slowly severed our ties. And we got a constitution only in 1984, I think it was, and yet the King of England is still the King of Canada. So it's like, okay, that's kind of incremental. That's like the kid who doesn't leave home till they're 40 or 50 or something. However, if you think about, okay, where did we get Canada, the United States, and the world today? Which is more advanced as a democracy, embracing the kinds of principles that we bring to bear here. The incremental approach maybe can be of some value. So I'm actually, you know, based on what we had to say in the breakout groups, and the promise that lots of people who I respect see in JEB and KCTW, I think I'm becoming more of a fan of the incremental approach. So, okay, we're not going to just throw out the stool, even though it's settler colonialism, it really is. But we're going to add chairs. I mean, we're going to add legs to this chair, and then actually maybe it won't be incrementally, slowly but slowly, maybe it will not be settler colonialism anymore. Maybe it will be transformed. Maybe it'll be something else. So, you know, and this kind of responds to, Jay, what you said about Indigenous-led initiatives, and it leads me back to, well, okay, so how about all the JEB people organize the next Columbia Basin Symposium? Get us all here next year. Or this was a great place. Is Brian still here? Did everybody leave? Oh, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. So how about a JEB-led initiative that brings everybody together? So that might be one way. And I want to finish, actually, is Jeanette here? Jeanette's still here. Thank you. Jeanette and Marlo. That's great. So I think, you know, this was something that really struck me. And Adam, you cited this from Jeanette's talk last night. Governance is how we all get along. I love that. Governance is how we all get along. So actually, we don't need IRBO to all get along. And maybe we'd be better off with one for a while. We need to spend the time it takes to all get along, get to know one another, hear one another, work together to do the things, as so many messages in the films and the talks have said, what is it we can actually do now together that we all agree on? Well, if we can all agree to get together and talk and listen, that's something we can do. So well, let's all get along.
Before we turn it over to Barb, I just want to reflect back. When we all started the Universities Consortium, there were 4 of us. It was me and Barb and Matt McKinney from the University of Montana, who's busy now with the Colorado, and Richard Paisley from UBC. And I realized this was 2007 when we started this. And I got to say, if there's a rudder to this process, or if there's a backbone to this process, or if there's a heart and soul to this process, it's Barb Cousins. And I got to say, it's been such a joy working with you all this time, Barb. It is such a joy. Please.
And what's really hard, is that working? What's really hard is I was just going to diss Aaron. You know, now I can't even do it. But I will anyway. So, let's leave that. So Aaron asked me, since knowing that there would be nothing to add to what these wonderful people have said, he asked me to summarize basically the full 2 days. So just to warn you, Aaron will be paying for dinner. It will be brought in. We'll be here a while. Actually, a lot shorter than that. As Aaron was saying, we started this process as the Universities Consortium in 2007, and what we came together for was to provide a forum for public education and a two-way dialogue. And our whole goal was to empower you to speak, not to speak for you. But if you asked us to transmit your ideas that we heard you say at these meetings to decision makers, so maybe that's privilege talking to privilege. First observation I want to make is we have come a long way. At that first symposium we held, we were told all we need to do with the Columbia River Treaty is extend the flood risk management provisions, and the U.S. pay more money. We were told an indigenous voice at the table is a non-starter. Mm-hmm. We were told salmon will never be above Grand Coulee. Mm-hmm. Today, ecosystem function, even if it's a shorter leg on the stool, is in the agreement in principle. Indigenous observers in Canada and experts in the United States have been at the table, and there are now 2 proposed organizations that are Indigenous-led that will have a voice, give a voice to ecosystem function in the AIP. And as we saw so emotionally today, and it makes me emotional even to talk about it, salmon are swimming above Grand Coulee. And I just want to say, you did that. You did that. All of you and people like you, whether at the table or speaking from the outside. Yeah, give yourself a hand. You did that. Second observation, we have a long way to go, okay? So, my role in this has always been, you know, I leave it to Aaron, to former students like Adam, to really get the big, innovative ideas out there. What my role has always been, and it's because when I wear my other hat as a mediator, it's the role I play, is to look at that, to listen to what people say, to hear the constraints that people observe that we have. And my role has always been to try and weave a thread through this. So what I'd like to do now is just say, here, from what I've heard from all of you for these 2 days, and but particularly from this latest panel, here's one thread. Here's one possible way we could weave our way through it. What I've heard in terms of constraints is that, and this is from this meeting and other meetings where I've heard the AIP presented, is that any major changes to the key points that are in the AIP, so those go to the exact numbers for allocating storage, the amount of money that's going to exchange hands, those things, and the addition of ecosystem function, those things have been very hard fought. And we try to change those at this point in the game, and we really risk upsetting the apple cart, because those are hard-fought bounds. And I'm also aware of comments like Wes McCart made that not everything has to be in a treaty. In fact, if you try to put everything in there, it might sink of its own weight. But the other thing that I've heard is, and I've heard both people making these decisions and people in this room say it, and a lot of you say it, is maybe the process of putting meat on the bones of the AIP can be one where we try to step outside the box a little, do a little bit of innovation, but can it be not just in putting in the big idea, but in setting up a process for incremental change? Can we set up that process so we don't have to wait 20 years if something we did isn't quite working out? So we have a process for tweaking it as we go. So what would that look like in terms of what people have been talking about? One thing is really easy. Change the composition of the entities so that ecosystem function, you have expertise on ecosystem function in the composition of the entities. Most of you probably know this, but if you don't, that's something that can be done at any time under the existing treaty. It is something that is done domestically, so by executive order in the United States, and it would be done by the government of BC and Canada. Add ecosystem function to the entities. The second thing is a little bit more innovative, but still keeps it within that framework and can also be incremental, and that is, currently there's a permanent engineering board. One of its duties is to resolve disputes. What if that reflected the sovereigns? What if the permanent engineering board was changed to reflect the sovereigns so that you had federal, provincial, state, tribal, and First Nation representatives on the permanent engineering board? And it could work by using, to resolve, its first duty would be the one it currently has now, that's to resolve disputes. So for example, when there's a recommendation from the JEB on ecosystem function and the entities consider it and reject it, and JEB objects to that, that can be bumped to the Permanent Engineering Board to resolve. And in doing so, that Permanent Engineering Board could rely on independent scientific experts. Doesn't necessarily have to be an advisory board, just turn to experts outside of representatives of the various interests involved. The second duty that could be added to this new permanent board would be public engagement. It could be annual, it could be biannual, it could be biennial, which I had to look up, it means every 2 years. And that could be an investment, that could be something that a body that has been invested in and has funding has the duty of setting up. We will have a forum, we will bring together the entities, the JEB, the Kootenai Transboundary Working Group, and the citizens of this basin, and the scientists involved, and we will talk about the state of the river. We will inform people on state of the river, and we'll have a two-way dialogue with the people in the basin. And then the third duty is this idea of incrementalism, that I think there's 5 years or 4 years, some kind of review that people are already talking about with the JEB. Well, every 5 years or so, there is a review that this permanent body oversees, where we look at the implementation of the treaty and say, how is it working? So not just, gee, did climate change blow our rule curves out of the water? No pun intended there. But that is one thing, one adaptation we need to have, is a way to review that. But also, are the governance systems we set up working? Are we having meetings with the public often enough? Are we doing it too often? Are we getting good feedback from that? Do we need to do something else? Is the JEB working? Is the Kootenai Group working? Is the Kootenai Group something that could be sort of considered a proof of concept, and maybe we want to expand that to the concept of having sub-basin working groups? If it worked really well, maybe build on that. Can those types of opportunities for incremental change be built in as we're putting meat on the AIP, so we don't lock ourselves in to something for the next 20 years and only to see things change? So with that, I would like to conclude by saying thank you to the people who have made this happen, particularly John Wagner, Joanne Taylor, Rianne, all the people that have put this together, John Osborne, my fellow UCCRG, and all of you, because if you didn't come and share your ideas, and those of you, Kathy may have left, but Steve's still here, and Troy and Jay, people who have been at the table, thank you for being here. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for sitting with us through all of this.
I think in the interest of time, I teach undergrads, and I'm an expert in reading blood sugar. It's late, and so I think we're going to forego questions. We'll all be around, and if you have questions for people, just go ahead and sidle up to them. But I want to thank everybody that Barb just thanked, but also this panel. I mean, I think it's representative. The other thing I was reflecting, Barb, when the first meeting in 2007. Every presentation had numbers in it, and that's changed profoundly. We're now talking from the heart, we're talking from the soul, we're talking about a community that we just want to keep perpetuating and being in contact with each other, and I think that's a profound change. So thank you all to the panel for being open, for presenting your views. Let's give them all a big round of applause, please. And over to you, Joanne.
So before everyone heads out, we have a quick panel for about 15 minutes of the youth rapporteurs who are reporting out. We have Caitlin Adam, Hannah Hemmerly, Ashley D. Macoro Powell, and Jacob Burnell. They are the youth rapporteurs who will be presenting a report of the entire symposium, and they will come up on stage now, please. They're going to share their insights of the conference in anticipation of their final report, which will be announced in early 2025. So come on up, youth rapporteurs. Caitlin, Hannah, Ashley, and Jacob.
So as the rapporteurs come to the stage, I'm going to just give you some more insight in what they've been doing throughout the conference. There you go. Here you have them. So we gather applications when we're finding youth members to participate, and these 4 people stood out in our eyes for their expertise and commitment to different aspects that relate to the governance of the river. So we asked them to kindly, thank you. We asked them to kindly sit down throughout the symposium, listen with attentive ear, and gather as many information as possible so that at the end of the whole process that the symposium represents, we're going to have a report that sort of accounts for what happened from a perspective that is their perspective, but also capable of recounting to someone who was not here or wants to recollect what happened objectively, as objectively as possible, all of the events that happened during the symposium. So you're going to see the reports, and we're going to have 4 thematic reports drafted individually by each of them, and 1 comprehensive report co-drafted by representatives from the North American Youth Parliament for Water and ourselves, that is going to integrate an additional report that the other partners to the symposium are going to draft, a more lengthy one of sort. So I'm just going to give the microphone to the rapporteurs. You're going to hear from them about their insights and impressions just before drafting the report, which will be shared in early 2025. Thank you. A round of applause,
please. Is this on? Okay, super. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give a brief introduction and then just a very quick reflection. My name is Hannah Hammerly. I've just joined the School of the Environment at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, a bit south of here, this semester as an assistant professor. I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist, and I'm interested in the dynamics of conflict and collaboration in water and energy governance, as well as the processes that go along with institutional change. And I've been fortunate to be in academia, but also in science policy and science diplomacy spaces outside of that context. And I'm interested in bridging these areas to conduct youth-inspired and community-engaged work on social ecological challenges. And I say that because that's really what drew me to this symposium and to this collaborative community here, where I've genuinely been inspired by examples of putting these aspirations into action. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, but I've lived in the Columbia River Basin now for about 2.5 years, and so thank you for having me. I've really appreciated learning from all of you during this symposium and getting to connect with some of you as well. And I'm not an expert in the Columbia River Treaty, but I have this generous opportunity to briefly present a few observations from a part of the symposium, and I'll do that from the perspective of a new observer. And just a quick caveat after listening to the wonderful afternoon here. As rapporteurs, we were asked to spend this time to either bring a point of view to the room based on our personal experience or expertise, or to reflect on a part of the symposium, and particularly on something that stood out to us or we thought was important. I've chosen to do the latter, but what I chose, as you'll find out in a moment, is something that has certainly stood out to others as well. And so I wanted to apologize for the repetition, but thank you for this moment anyway. I wanted to just highlight some of the initial reflections from the first panel yesterday. That was the panel that convened members of the Canadian and the US negotiating teams who shared insights into the AIP. And we learned about a number of characteristics, including, the primary changes. I'm going to skip over those. I was going to list them, and I just want to highlight one that's particularly, that I think was a particularly significant shift. And as I said, it's been mentioned a lot in the panels this afternoon. And I think it's going to be critical to focus on during the processes that move the basin from the AIP to the new treaty. And that's that expansion of the negotiation process to include engagement with First Nations, tribes, and other basin communities as well. And as we know, in terms of governance, this change materialized most concretely in the formation of the JEB and the Kootenay Transboundary Working Group. And I think that these bodies represent, as others, an exciting step forward in embedding ecosystem function and Indigenous cultural values into the treaty framework. And while this is an essential and long-needed change, I observed, as I'm sure some of you did as well, that many of the discussions throughout the symposium revealed that this arrangement remains unsatisfactory for some. There are concerns that ecosystem function hasn't been fully elevated to serve as the third pillar of the treaty on par with power generation and flood control. And additionally, the advisory status of the JEB raises questions about its actual power and impact within the treaty structure, and the geographic region of the working group being limited, as just a couple examples. So there was a bit of a disconnect that seemed to emerge between different panels and attendees regarding how significant the progress made really is in equally prioritizing ecosystem function, implementing adaptive management practice, and the breadth and depth of participation. But to end on a note of optimism, as the AIP transitions into the new treaty and also beyond that point, there remains clearly an opportunity to address these concerns, provided that they're really given due consideration, and of course outside of the institution of the treaty as well as was discussed this afternoon. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass the floor to my colleague, Caitlin.
So my name is Caitlin, and I'm currently doing my master's at UBC Okanagan, and my program is Community Engagement and Social Change and Equity, and my supervisor is Dr. Wagner. So I'm going to be studying sustainable community-based food systems in the Columbia River Basin, and I'm from Ontario, so this area and this field of work is very new for me, but I studied environmental studies in my undergrad at Trent University, which had a really heavy focus on Indigenous environmental ways of knowing, and so that's really inspired me, and so I really appreciated the Indigenous voices that we heard at the symposium. So for my perspectives and observations, again, it is kind of repetitive, so I think I might, I'm going to say my notes, but I'm also kind of going to deviate and say just some more personal observations. So for me as a youth, I feel like the environment, it's quite frustrating that it's always kind of pushed to the side. Because as we all know, the environment impacts every aspect of our lives. So I've done a lot of research on how it impacts mental and physical health. Obviously, it impacts the food system really heavily when we heard about droughts and floods and how that's just going to get worse with climate change. And that'll impact, so I'm studying the food system, and so that heavily impacts agriculture, and agriculture impacts our economy. So just everything is impacted by the environment. And so for me, as a youth who, this is the decisions we make now, our future is very dependent on the decisions that we make. And so for me, the environment is always, I think about it every day, and honestly, I'm terrified as to what the future is going to hold. So things like the AIP, I really, I wish the environment was part of that a little bit more. So I think compared to the previous treaty, this AIP is definitely including the environment and Indigenous voices, which I really love, but I do think, as many people have expressed, that needs to go much further. And I just think well-being of humans and non-human life needs to be prioritized over economic gain. And regarding community engagement, so my whole program is basically focused on community engagement, and I chose it because of that unique focus. I think it's so important to actually speak to the people who are impacted by decisions, and again, I feel like from hearing different panelists and in conversations that I've had at the symposium, it really doesn't seem like engagement. It seems like it was more surface level, and people seem quite frustrated by that from what I've observed. So people are, wanting their voices heard, people who are actually living in this area and who are impacted by pollution and, the salmon not being here, like that impacts everyday people, but yet it seems like the everyday people are not the ones that actually get to make the decisions. So one thing we've learned in my courses a lot is when researchers or whoever else engages with communities, the outcomes are actually much better. And we've read so many different case studies where that's shown to be true. And so I just feel like if we incorporated community voices, not just listened to community voices, but actually incorporated them and listened to them and put them into action, I think the AIP and everything just could be so much better. And the land could be healthier, we could be healthier mentally and physically and spiritually, as some people mention. I just think community engagement is so important and the environment is so important. And so those are just kind of my personal perspectives. And I also want to say how inspired I am by the salmon reintroduction. I watched the documentary and I thought it was really beautiful how, honestly, I didn't even know that the salmon were reintroduced recently, and I just moved to Kelowna in the Okanagan, and I actually got to see the kokanee salmon, which was really incredible, and I had no idea that was such a big deal. Like, I had no idea all the work that had been done to make that happen. So I saw them, and I thought they were the most beautifully colored fish with the bright red and bright green, and it was such an honor to see that, and now I feel even more honored to have seen that because they weren't there for so long. So yeah, thank you to everyone who has contributed to all the great restoration work, and obviously we have a long way to go, but I just want to thank everyone for the work that they've done.
Hi everybody, my name is Ashley Makoro-Powell. I'm going to speak more from my positionality coming to this event. Personally, because I'm still processing a lot of the material that has been shared today, but I wanted to express my gratitude to my colleagues and mentors from the University of Washington, Seattle that supported me in being here again after taking me on a field course through the Columbia Basin as a guest last summer for my first time. For context, I was born and raised in Washington State in unincorporated Pierce County, the lands of the Puyallup tribe. I'm not indigenous, I'm diasporic, so I was born here in the United States, but my mom's family were immigrants, and then my dad is multi-generational and was born in Yakima, but have family ties to Cle Elum, Ellens, Tieton, and several other areas in central and eastern Washington. So I've grown up going around and crisscrossing the Pacific Northwest with my family to be with them. I'm a first-generation scientist, but I'm also a two-time dropout. So I kind of face what a lot of Washington State students regularly face in the Pacific Northwest, which is discrimination in our public school systems and disinvestment in us. And so that's the positionality I'm speaking from today. I feel really privileged to be here, to be in this space on an international and transboundary space, working with so many beautiful people and listening to you all. I constantly am in these spaces and constantly thinking, like, how do I break this down and share this to, like, the high school students that I'm working with, and sometimes in the summertime, or like community members going through a lot of different basic needs and challenges, or maybe facing different forms of violence in their community. So those are things that I kind of think about. It's like, what is their tie, right? So just as an example, for the last several years during the pandemic, when no one wanted to come to Central Washington because of this big pandemic and various different vaccination things, and just, different people have different positions on comfort and level. I was reached out to by public schools and saying, like, we're trying to do our first career fair and, like, science fair, and no one will come, right? And so, like, I went, right, and I tabled as being a member for another affiliation that's based in Florida but works globally called Minorities in Shark Sciences, which was started by 4 Black marine biologists that have faced heavy discrimination in, like, transboundary water spaces. And I went there and shared some of that, like, knowledge that I have as being a field biologist, someone that's a woman, who's disabled, who's faced gender violence and things like that, and spoke with some of those students and tried to, like, engage with them so they can see beyond the classroom. A lot of administrators, I'm not gonna point fingers and name names, but, like, in those spaces constantly say, they're never gonna become anything, right? And so it's like, that's really discouraging for me, and I'm just, like, putting this out to you all to think about, because we heard a lot about the future and the present, and I appreciate the North American youth and the people that were all in those spaces together, even if I missed you all on day 0, like bringing us into this space together, because I don't feel like there's enough of that time to kind of interact with each other and to be in these spaces and have discussions and share our perspectives. So I just like wanted to bring that as a challenge to all of you to think about wherever it is that you work in your community, like how are you thinking about your transition? Like who are you sharing your knowledge with? Why are you sharing your knowledge with those people? Is it the right people, right? Like if you are working really siloed in a space, like what kind of community impact do you have? Because that's kind of how I'm trying to think through this, of just like there's so many youth along the Columbia Basin, just in Washington, that don't know anything about it. We don't talk about it, even though we have mandated like curriculum called like Climb Time, for instance. A lot of it's really nuanced, like composting in schools or like some small water quality things. But you know, like I want to actually like see that like tangible for them, because it's like right outside their neighborhoods, like my own. I grew up in an unincorporated area that used to be, my dad worked in timber, for instance. He was a lot in logging and processing wood. And I live next to railroad track where I see a lot of the oil trains come through in the Tacoma area. And that impacts me. I don't even grow food outside where I rent, because like when I went out there the first year that I rent, there was soot everywhere. So, you know, these are like the direct impacts that I'm thinking about, like when I hear all you guys share your stories. So I like lift my hands to you for doing this work, because I know it takes a lot of us, but just like wanting to put like a challenge to myself of like how to bring this back and share it with my community, but also for you all as well. So thanks for letting me be here. I'll pass it on to Jacob.
Working? Cool. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacob Bernal. I'm a grad student at Washington State University, where I study collaborative watershed management regarding wildfire and drinking water supply here in the basin. I'm also a part of a program called the Rivers, Watersheds, and Communities, where we're rooted in science and community-engaged research here in the basin. And so if there's anybody that's interested in talking more about that, I'd be happy to chat about that. It's a pleasure to be here as someone who was born in the basin. I was born in Boise, Idaho, and have been all over the place here in the Northwest, sampling water quality, writing up campaign letter with tribes, and now doing academic research. So, you know, this landscape really intersects with my professional, academic, and personal life. And so it's really a great opportunity to be able to report on this conference. I've learned a lot, but I really want to speak more on behalf of my personal take. So just really taking away from these last couple of days, it's obviously really evident that there are still frustrations and concerns, and my peers have highlighted that, and so have you all. But the way that I look at it is that the basin has the opportunity of a lifetime to be leaders not only in this region, but in this country and also in this world. You know, I think we really have to take away the goods and the bads from other treaties around the world, but we also especially must learn from our own mistakes. And so I think we cannot let history repeat itself, and we really need to take advantage of this opportunity to be inclusive and think about these other factors. And again, that's been highlighted so many times. A really good point that was made is that we really must transition from consulting to collaborating. I thought that really struck me, and it's going to take some time. It's going to take some changing in our values and way of thinking. But not only can we do that, I think we really need to take action on the ground and start engaging. And so another aspect that I was thinking about, you know, sometimes we hear in the policy arena, if someone is upset about a policy, it must be a good policy. And I really disagree with that. I think that we need to leave the table with some sort of benefit. It's impossible for everyone to actually be happy with any decision. That's just the reality. But if we can walk away with something, I think that's truly a good policy. So there's a lot for us to do to move forward, but I think we're in a really great position, and we have an opportunity to do that, to be a great model, not only for our communities, but globally and for other countries that are facing similar transboundary water issues. But we also really need to meet the needs for our people and our planet. Thank you.
Thank you all. I believe this was the last. Okay, we have a closing plenary coming, so don't escape yet. Thank you so much for the time you allowed us to occupy, and thank to the rapporteurs for the incredible work they've done, and they will keep doing up until the report is out. It's a lot of work, so we are really grateful that you've taken it up. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everybody that's still here, and thank you to the youth. We're going to have a very short closing plenary, I think, or closing statements. And the first person I'd like to bring up is Aaron. Come on up.
I said it all before. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming together. Thank you for opening your hearts to this process. It's been a great journey thus far, and it feels like we're just beginning. So I'm looking forward to the next steps. Thank you all.
And I know that Barb and Aaron were hand wrestling earlier on today about who should come up to say, and we'd just like to have you come up and just give a final goodbye to everybody. One more time. John Osborne, you're next. And then Henry.
Well, I think I poured my heart out in the last thing, so I don't have much more to say except thank you to all of you. You're what makes a difference in this basin, you and people like you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone who helped organize this, and safe travels, whatever part of the basin you are headed to. Thank you.
John Osborne, and then Henry, and then John Wagner.
I know you all want to get home, so it's been very interesting. We've done the One River Ethics Matter conferences now for 11 years, and it's been very interesting to kind of combine with really where we started, that conference in Polson at Flathead Lake. It's been an incredible journey, so thank you all for being part of it. And some of you have been part of it a lot. So, okay, Henry.
I'll keep this brief, but just wanted to say that one of the reasons I'm so passionate about working with my fellow youth and young people is that our initial ideas and imaginings of a new world and a new way of doing water governance aren't being hindered by the strings and the logistics of what is possible and what's realistic. We imagine what should be, not what could be, and then we demand that the world finds a new path. And I think that optimism and that creativity is something that everyone in this room remembers having as a young person. And I think sometimes as you age, you might just forget. So I think that's my call to all of the professionals in the room with expertise and decades of knowledge. Go back to your local communities and find young people and engage with them, because I hope, as you've seen throughout this symposium, that if you give young people an opportunity, they will take it. We do rise to the challenge. So thank you to all of our young advocates that were rapporteurs, that went through the training, and we'll see you next year.
John Wagner, come on up.
Okay, here we are at the end. I should just maybe share briefly that, in case you may not have realized this, the organizing of this symposium was extremely arduous, which is why we really need that fourth leg. It's like to organize this kind of symposium in a kind of ad hoc way with largely volunteer labor, with just scrounged together financial support, is not something we should have to do. We should have a better way of putting this all together. But there was a wonderful team. It was a wonderful team to work with, and having you all here over these last 2 days has made it certainly all more than worthwhile for me. In terms of the effort I put into it, it's been really a wonderful, wonderful transformative event in my life, the building of many new relationships. But okay, I think we would be remiss not to acknowledge the extraordinary effort and commitment of certain people, while everybody on the organizing team and the advisory committee were so important, and many others in their contributions, and inevitably somebody who really merits a thank you will not get it. So sorry about that, but Joanne. All of you have seen the role she's playing in, and you've received her many emails. I won't say too many emails, but you understand how much work she's put into this. But I also want to point out that it was really Joanne 3 years ago who came to me first, and actually Richard Paisley, another member of the University Consortium, and said, how about I apply for postdoctoral fellowship and get some funding so I can devote myself full time to this work, to the Columbia Basin citizen public engagement work, to perhaps some effort towards creating an IRBO or some kind of transboundary organization that we don't have yet and desperately need. And I said, sure, I'll sign on as your supervisor because that's the way it works at the university. So Joanne wrote that application, and at some point along there, we approached the consortium, and John also, and we said, how about, basically Joanne said, how about if I get this money and I'm willing to commit myself to this, will you work with us and be advisors to help us organize some symposium and other research and public engagement activities? And bless their hearts, they said, yay. I think actually, if somebody can correct me, but I think it was Barb who said, the consortium lives again. Somebody told me that. I might be wrong. But anyway, so we want to acknowledge the fact that this would not have happened without Joanne. And it wasn't just her brainstorm to begin with, but it was also the fact that the number of hours she's put into this and her level of commitment, all times of the day. So Joanne, it's come. I mean, this is such a minor gift of acknowledgement. You'll just find a token acknowledgement in there, Rianne. So we did not start our planning out with Rianne in mind, and then we found we were probably not going to succeed in organizing this symposium unless we had somebody with some serious professional skills to help us out. And just guess what? Rianne, who I'm supervising in her PhD program, happens to have a background as a professional conference organizer. And although she's kind of trying to be busy doing her PhD, we asked her, would you be willing to help out? We desperately need somebody with your skills. Just, a few hours a week, we'll pay you a little bit. Meanwhile, it's turned into like a 60-hour-a-week job. But the fact that we pulled it all together, that she pulled it all together. She pulled it all together. And I'm not sure I'm the right person for the final gift, the final acknowledgement, a modest gift. Barb. So there were times when some of us on the team flagged a little bit, I flagged. I had some medical problems, so I have a reason for having flagged. But, in various ways, some of us didn't quite step up in times when we might have. I won't single out any other names of people. But one person who never flagged, where'd you go, was Barb. And if somebody else flagged, she stepped in and picked up the slack. And sometimes she was a little bit, like, for God's sakes, come on, do your job. But nevertheless, she would not let us down. She made sure the work got done, and it got done to a good standard. And like nobody else in the group, she put in the time. Is that because you're retired and you have more time? I don't think so. I think it's because her level of commitment, going back to 2007 and before 2007, has been so deep and so strong in this group and in organizing these symposium. So, Barb. And you might want to check that gift and give a certain member of the consortium a bit of a hard time again for that. If you figure out what trick led to you getting that particular small gift. Okay, a little puzzle. We'll leave you with that. A little secret puzzle. And okay, otherwise, am I the last speaker? No. Yeah. So thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure to be part of this process and to see you all here. Okay.
Okay, that leaves me to say my thank yous now, but thank you, John, for explaining the history of how we got here and the application, and thank you to UCCRG, so that's Barb and Aaron and Richard, for accepting the invitation to be my advisors. I'm sure you never thought how much advising I needed. I really stand on the shoulders of giants, it's true. Along the process, is Brian still here? Brian came on board onto UCCRG as well, and he actually said, well, we can host it at our university if you like, and we had no idea. I'm sure he had no idea of what he was getting into, but this has been a beautiful venue. We've had 3 lovely rooms. We've had audiovisual tech, streaming, and ALS interpreters, and you've held our funds for us, and you held the registration platform, and Caitlin helped us so much. So I'd like to say a really, really big thank you to Brian Henning. Last year we partnered with Orem and John Osborne, so I'd like to say a big thank you for everything that you've done to come together in this partnership. I really, really appreciate it, and we all do. North American Youth Parliament for Water. It's been so much learning and fun, and I'm just in really deep gratitude for your presence and Justo's presence and Lauren, who couldn't be here with us, and the entire team of rapporteurs and the youth that partook in your training on Tuesday. Thank you very much, Henry, for leading the team. I'd also like to thank a very good friend of mine for her guidance and mentorship. All politics aside, she's a very, very close friend of mine, and that's Pauline Terbasket. Thank you, Pauline, for everything. Jeanette and Marlo have left, but I wanted to extend a thank you to them. They were my Indigenous professors way back when, and they really guided me in my journey towards being here today. Maureen has left. She was the brave soul who agreed to be my co-MC. There were other people that I had invited along the way, and they all just, first they'd say yes, and then they'd bow out when they found out what we were doing here. So it was a huge task. And so Maureen, you might see this on streaming. Thank you very, very much. We've just made a really new friendship. So let's have a clap for Maureen. Rayanne, what can I say? early mornings at 6 a.m., late nights at 11 p.m. every single day for the last 2 months. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being there. You and John were really just my sounding boards and friends, so thank you very much. Who am I missing? Let's see. John Wagner. You're my teacher, my colleague, my co-conspirator, and most of all, my friend. Thank you very much for everything. And two last people, my sons who are youth, and I just want to say thank you to them because they're listening to the stream. They text me every day, a couple times a day, and they say, "Mom, you're rocking it," or "Mom, you're a kick ass." And heart emoji, fist pump, way to go, you're awesome. And so thank you, Nikita and Alex. I love you. Okay, that's it. The symposium is now officially closed and over. Safe travels, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Bye-bye.